and she creamed where her skin was rough and powdered where it was smooth, and shaved her legs and her underarms regularly, and washed her hair every day, and used the most expensive shampoo and conditioner, and at least twice a week she gave her nurse's fingernails a manicure. Well, no more. No more. She got out of the tub and put her robe on, thinking. She spent a lot of time thinking now. She didn't know what she'd done with her days before Charlie disappeared, and she'd started thinking again, absorbing herself in speculation, in study, in scrutiny, investigation, calculation, analysis. This thing that's happened to me, it's not what I know, she thought. Get to know it, she thought. Why did I have the locks changed? What was there between us? Emma, listening for a reply, heard only white sound. In the kitchen she poured herself some wine and fixed a plate of crackers and cheese. In the living room she sat in the easy chair, arranged the skirt of her robe to cover her ankles, and called Lorraine. "I have to get a job," she said, "in a few months." Said Lorraine. "You're okay for money for now, though, because I could help if you need it." "I've got $16,000 in cash. That'll do me until the fall. I don't know what kind of job I can get, though." She put some brie on a piece of Melba toast. "I never used my damn degree. I don't have any damn experience." Said Lorraine. Emma munched on the cheese and cracker. "Charlie screwed around on me. Did you know that?" "Emma, come on," Lorraine sputtered into the phone. "Well," said Emma, smiling, "you knew him. Did you think he was screwing around?" She cut off a chunk of white cheddar and popped it into her mouth. "I never liked the guy, since long before he met you. What do you expect me to say? Sure, I think he was capable of screwing around on you. Whether he actually did or not, how would I know?" "Why are you using the past tense? I'm pretty sure he isn't dead." Although she thought Charlie dead would have been infinitely preferable to Charlie having sneaked away on her. Emma swallowed some wine and selected another piece of cheese. Edam this time. "He might as well be dead, as far as you're concerned." "What else do you think he was capable of?" "Emma, a man who deserts his wife instead of having the guts to say he wants out of his marriage. Face it, Emma, the guy is a jerk, a dork, a no-nuts, wise-ass, cretinous, fat-headed jerk, capable of anything." A few minutes later, Emma replaced the receiver and carried the plate and the glass into the kitchen. Then she went into the bedroom and opened the drawer in Charlie's night table. The gun was still there, along with a small box of ammunition. Satisfied, Emma closed the drawer. She turned off the overhead light and climbed into bed, leaving the lamp on. She lay with her hands behind her head, remembering. It was about a month after Emma had found out about Charlie's adultery that he'd brought it up again. "Emma," he'd said, "I think we should talk." It was evening, and they were sitting in the living room watching the television news. Immediately, Emma felt under siege. Adrenaline surged to the rescue. How idiotic, she thought, that her body should blindly prepare itself for a physical confrontation that wasn't going to happen, while her beleaguered mind just lay there, defenseless and cringing. She reached for the remote control device and switched off the TV set. "You deserve better than this," said Charlie. He was sitting on the sofa, his long legs stretched out, his hands clasped in his lap. "Better than what?" "Better than a husband who plays around." Emma examined this sentence carefully, moving its component parts around in her head, the words and their potential meanings, and the several ways in which a person might react to what she'd heard. "I'm really very sorry, Emma. I really am." "I accept your apology, Charlie, and I appreciate it. It started—" "No," said Emma sharply. "Really, Charlie, I think it's best if we don't go into it." She gave him a tentative smile. We should go forward, not backward. That's what I'm trying to do, but I don't want to plunge into the future thoughtlessly, Emma. I want to do things right. Emma's love for him at that moment was so tender and poignant it brought tears to her eyes. He got up and came over to the big stuffed chair and sat on the armrest. He put his arm around her. "This is not the first affair I've had, Emma. It just isn't working, hon. It'll be better for both of us if we get a divorce." Of course, he had been wrong about that, Emma reflected, switching off her bedside lamp. But what a lot of time got wasted. What a lot of pain there'd been before he came to see things her way. As she prepared herself for sleep, Emma realized that she no longer traveled through her days as if Charlie were watching her. Chapter 32. Dear Kathy, Caroline, and Sandy. Eddie read the letter again, taking a bite of his ham and cheese sandwich. You know how terribly sorry we all were to hear about Melanie. One piece of bread had mustard on it. The other one had mayonnaise. We will all miss her dreadfully, although not nearly as much, I know, as you three will. The bread was whole wheat, the cheese was Swiss, and the ham was Black Forest, sliced, not shaved. This must be an extremely difficult time for you. Eddie tried to take small bites so the sandwich would last longer, but this was hard because he was very hungry. He read the next paragraph slowly, concentrating. I know you're rethinking your commitment to us, and I don't blame you, but I hope you'll allow me to suggest that to go ahead with your plans, even without Melanie, might be as good for you as it would be for us. Eddie, chewing, still couldn't make sense of that part. You'd be kept extremely busy, of course, and I know you'd enjoy Seashelt a lot, especially in the summer. He didn't like the sound of that one bit. I'm afraid I have to know one way or the other by the end of the week. Eddie licked mustard from his fingers, then put down the letter to wipe his hand on the paper towel he was using as a napkin. The end of the week. That would be Saturday, more likely Friday, because this was a business-type letter. He could tell by the official paper, with the name and address and everything, even though it was trying to sound so friendly. Today was Tuesday. I look forward to hearing from you. He tore up the letter and the envelope it had come in, and flushed the pieces down the toilet. Staking out the house had paid off after all. He'd been a little worried to find out that there were actually 3 apartments in the place, with 2 more girls living in the top part and a guy in the bottom part. But they were out all day, every day. Not Melanie's roommates, though. He was having a hard time making head or tail out of their comings and goings, and this was necessary if he was going to end up with a foolproof plan. He figured he'd better check out the place where she'd worked, too. So yesterday he'd gone in there, bold as brass, and sat down at the counter and ordered a coffee. He was eyeing the owner of the place and trying to get up his nerve to ask about her, casual-like. He had it all worked out and had practiced it at home. "Say, where's the blonde girl who used to work here?" he would say. And if the guy looked at him suspiciously, Eddie planned to add, "She's a real good waitress," or something like that. Well, he was working up to this when all of a sudden the door opened and this girl walked in who lived in the house, the one with her hair cut uneven. Eddie damn near choked on his coffee. He huddled into his jacket, holding up the newspaper that lay on the counter, hiding his face behind it, and then trying to hear their conversation. But the guy was whispering for some damn reason. Eddie peered over the top of the paper to see if they were looking at him, but they weren't. And then he saw the guy hand her a box, a small cardboard box, and Eddie knew that this box had to do with Melanie, and he was absolutely sure that at least one of his notes was in there. He'd delivered the second one here to the cafe in the middle of the night, slipped it through the mail slot in the door. She must have told her boss about it, too, he thought all of a sudden. But he changed his mind about that right away, because it was plain as plain the guy had never seen Eddie in his life before. When he looked at him, Eddie could tell that. for sure. So even if she told him what happened, she couldn't have told him what Eddie looked like, and so he was safe there. When the girl left the cafe, he had put money on the counter and hurried out after her. He made sure to turn in the opposite direction, though, and stand a ways down the street and count slowly to 30 before turning around to follow her. This was in case the guy in the cafe got suspicious. But Eddie sneaked a glance in there as he passed, and the guy was leaning on the counter with his chin on his hand, reading the paper. He followed her all the way home, and once she spotted him, but she didn't really notice him, which usually was a thing that made Eddie mad, but not this time. Up the street from her house was one with a for sale sign out front, and it was empty. So Eddie strolled around, looking at this house, staring in the windows, checking this and that, like he was interested in buying it. He even wrote stuff in his notebook about it, in case somebody was watching him. And all the time, of course, he was keeping an eagle eye on the roommate's house, trying to think what to do about that box. Eventually, he'd had to stop pretending he wanted to buy this place, which was a falling-down piece of shit anyway, when you looked at it close up, and he just sat down on the lawn with his back against a tree trunk and watched the roommate's house and worked on his problem. After a long time, two of the girls came out of the house together, which left inside only the one with the box. Eddie waited tensely, hoping she'd leave too, and then the mailman came. And as soon as he'd moved on down the street, Eddie, without even thinking about it, ran across the road, snatched the mail from the box, and hurried away around the corner and into a little park, where he looked through the mail as if it were his, and stuck 2 envelopes into his jacket pocket. Next, he had to go back there and return the rest of it, the bills and advertising junk and what-not. He was a lot more nervous doing this than he'd been when he'd taken it in the first place. Then he'd watched himself as if from a distance, amazed and horrified, watched himself dart slick as a bug across the street, up the steps, and whip the mail out of the box and whirl around to scurry away. But when he had to put it back, he felt palpably there, all right, big and lumbering and cumbersome and noisy. Jesus, but he was loud, clambering up those steps. Eddie put his plate in the kitchen sink, got himself a beer, and sat down to have another look at the second letter. This one was addressed to Melanie Franklin. That was her last name, Franklin. It, too, was a typewritten, business-like-looking letter, and it was from the university. Eddie had whooped out loud when he first read it, because it was the library telling her off because she had a book overdue. But then he thought about how he'd seen her lying on the pavement, and the only thing moving was the pages of her book, and he wondered if that was the book they meant, and for a minute he felt sick and sad. But there wasn't any future in feeling sick and sad. Now he tore up that letter, too, and its envelope, and flushed it down the john like the other one. He opened his notebook to see all that he'd learned, but when he got to the end of what he'd written there, only one thing really stuck in his mind. His job was going to be a lot easier now, once he got in there. A box was a lot easier to find than a little piece of paper. But there was some urgency about everything because of the letter. He was going to have to do it really, really soon. He hadn't worked it all out perfectly in his mind yet, though. He was still doing the planning part. But he'd have to put some speed on, that was for sure. He thought and thought, but his thoughts ran around and around in his head like frantic little rabbits and led him nowhere. Nowhere at all. Eddie put the notebook on the coffee table, took a drink of beer, and leaned back on the sofa. He wondered if you could get that seeing yourself from a distance feeling on purpose. He thought it would come in very handy sometimes, when you had stuff you didn't want to do, you were afraid to do, but you absolutely for sure had to do, like get in there and get that box. Chapter 33. Alberg telephoned Emma on Wednesday morning to tell her he'd gotten more information from the woman in the leather shop. When she said he paid in cash, he told her, she meant traveler's checks. He's got another bank account, at least he did have, in Vancouver. Emma was stirring porridge in a small pot. She'd decided to start eating well again, building up her strength. Had one? You mean he doesn't have it anymore? Yeah, he closed it a month ago. Left no forwarding address. Also, his car's turned up. Emma stopped stirring. She looked intently at the face of the clock in the stove's accessory panel. It was 9:17. Where? In a parking lot at the Vancouver airport. But I thought you told me he didn't take a plane anywhere. I told you he wasn't booked out on any flights under his own name. Right, I remember, she said dully. Don't give up yet, said Alberg. I've got a couple of things I'm working on. What things? She gripped the phone between ear and shoulder while she spooned the porridge into a cereal bowl. I'll tell you about it next time I see you. When she'd hung up, Emma sat down at the kitchen table to eat. On the table in front of her, next to a glass of orange juice, lay her weapon. It was a Smith & Wesson, .38, with a 5-inch barrel. Charlie had had it for years, ever since his father died. He should have gone down to the police station and gotten a permit for it, but he hadn't bothered. He never fired it. It was just a keepsake. A 1945 issue, he'd told her once, and she'd exclaimed politely. Emma hadn't even known he had ammunition for it, and then, looking into its dull gray muzzle that night, she'd heard him say, "It's loaded." She hadn't been able to tell, looking at it, if it was loaded or not. He might have been lying, but then she looked up at his face and saw that he wasn't. She pushed her porridge aside and picked up the revolver, cautiously, feeling the weight of it. Not a very big gun, really. She had several purses that were big enough to carry it, several coats and jackets with pockets big enough to accommodate it. It wasn't loaded now. She checked the cylinder to make sure. Although Emma still felt somewhat hesitant while handling it, she'd come to realize that it was really a very straightforward device. There was the cylinder, and when it was released, and it had been easy enough to figure out how to accomplish that, there were the 6 chambers for the bullets, and here was the hammer. But you didn't have to worry about doing anything with that, after all. Emma had always thought you had to cock a gun before you fired it, pull back on the hammer first, but apparently that wasn't necessary, at least not with this gun. She'd practiced loading and unloading it, and she'd practiced firing it while it was unloaded. Next, she was going to find a place somewhere out in the woods where she could fire it loaded. The cloth in which it was wrapped smelled of oil. Probably it ought to be cleaned from time to time, this weapon. There was some printing on the top of the barrel. Smith & Wesson, Springfield, Massachusetts, she read. Patented, and several dates she couldn't make out. The revolver was less ugly than she had at first thought. It had wooden grips and a sleek barrel, and it fitted into her hand quite naturally. Emma was developing a plan, several aspects of which were still vague in her mind. Whenever she thought about this plan, her body felt as if it were sheathed in electric sparks. A cardboard box sat on the table. Dominion center-fire cartridges, it said on the lid. Emma took off the lid and examined the bullets inside. Every time she visualized herself acting on her plan, instantly it was as if her skin were made of fire. She could feel it in her eyes, too, and thought that would be enough to do the job all by itself, her eyes filled with sparks and fire. But the gun was necessary, for symmetry. She removed a cartridge from the box and slipped it into a chamber and snapped the cylinder into place. She raised the revolver and pointed it at the front of the stove. She didn't know whether she'd loaded or not when the time came. Her throat had burned. Her mouth was dry. She tried to speak, but words wouldn't come. tried to open her eyes but could not, heard sounds but couldn't make sense of them, moved her hand. "Emma? Emma?" A worried voice, an anxious voice. She tried again. "Eyelids. Lift," she told them, and they did. And she saw Charlie, and saw that he was holding her hand. There was 1 second in which she saw relief on his face, felt loved and cosseted. Then memory spilled into her mind, and tears spilled from her eyes. She had turned away from him then, and said into the pillow, despite her shame, "I'll do it again if you leave me. I'll do it again." "No more," said Emma out loud in her kitchen. Really, she had been an awful fool, but no more. Chapter 34. "I want you to cut it," said Cassandra, who had gone to Vancouver for the day. Lenore, standing behind her, gazed intently into the mirror. She lifted Cassandra's hair and pulled it up and back. "How short?" "I don't know. What do you think?" Lenore considered. "You got quite a lot of gray. You want some color? Highlights?" "No color, no highlights. Only short. You go short, you're going to get more curl. Right now the weight of it pulls at your natural curl, straightening it somewhat. Cut it short, it's going to frizz right up." "I know that. I don't care. I want a change." "Color's a nice change." "Lenore, please, could we talk about length first? Then maybe I'll listen to color." "Not frizz. I shouldn't have said frizz. It's going to curl more, though, for sure. But if you don't mind that, okay." She stared at Cassandra in the mirror, playing with her hair, concentrating. "I'd say if you're going to do it good and proper. Get rid of all this. Keep the fullness around here. Do the bangs thing. What do you think?" "Okay," said Cassandra, "let's do it." "I see you lost a lot of weight," said Lenore, leading her to the sinks. "You quit eating or what?" "I got the flu," said Cassandra. "That's handy. You going to keep it off?" "I haven't decided," said Cassandra, leaning back in the chair, breathing in the fragrances of shampoos and conditioners and gels and mousses and perm solution and hair-coloring preparations. "I might." Alberg sat in his sun porch on Wednesday evening, wearing his reading glasses, studying his notebook, absorbed in the puzzle that was Charlie Aubray. He made a note to check the cabs operating out of the airport the day Charlie disappeared, in case Charlie had just used the long-term lot as a place to dump his vehicle and hadn't gotten on a plane at all. So far, he'd called 75 numbers from Nola King's collection of business cards, which represented everything from hairdressers' establishments to a piano tuner, from photographers to a healthcare worker, from car dealerships to florist shops. Several of the people he'd talked to knew Charlie, but only casually, and only in connection with the insurance business. Alberg put his glasses away and went outside into the backyard. It was ludicrous to be spending time on this thing. The guy had had months to get himself some false ID. He'd probably done the obvious, flown out of Vancouver Saturday evening, right after getting rid of his car. Alberg would never run him down. Nobody would ever run him down. He'd stick with it, though, until his leave ran out, which gave him less than a week. He found himself looking at the rioting rose bushes, the towering hydrangeas, the cherry trees run rampant. Jesus, he'd better hire somebody fast, he thought, hands in his pockets, eyeing the climbing roses waving 3 feet above the top of the fence. The hydrangeas were massive. He'd had no idea something called a shrub could grow that big. He walked around the house, which, when studied closely, revealed itself to be in need of a new coat of paint. Why hadn't he noticed that when he gave in and bought the place? He saw that the front porch had progressed from rickety to sagging, and that the sidewalk leading to it was cracked. What he ought to do, he thought, crossing his arms, was a substantial renovation. Could he afford that and a sailboat, too? His mind wandered back to Charlie Aubray. What if Charlie hadn't had anything exotic in mind, like fleeing to a warm beach somewhere? Apparently he hadn't been all that enthused about either his wife or his job. So what had he liked about his life? Maybe, Albert thought, if he could figure that out, he could make some progress. He was mulling this over when a car pulled up in front of his house. He turned, only mildly curious, and saw that it was an almost new Toyota, a 4-door, red. He'd never seen this car before. He'd never seen the woman who got out of it either. At least he didn't think he had until she turned around to face him, shading her eyes against the setting sun. "My God," said Alberg, "what did you do?" "I cleaned out my savings account," said Cassandra, "and put myself in hock again, too. Bought me a new car." She pushed the door closed. "And some new duds." She walked around the front of the car and through his broken gate and onto his cracked sidewalk. She held out her arms and turned slowly. "I've always admired your legs," said Alberg. "Never mind the legs. How about the suit?" "I like the suit very much indeed, because it shows so much of your legs." "What did you do to your hair?" She threw back her head and shook it from side to side. Then she stepped closer to him, running her hands through her hair. "I got it cut." "You sure did. I'm a whole new woman." He put his hands on her waist. "I hope not," he said, bending to kiss her temple, her cheek, her neck. He felt her shiver. "What are you up to?" he said into her ear, kissing her. "What are you up to, Cassandra?" She hugged him, pressing herself tightly against him. "I'm attempting," she said, "to alleviate my restlessness." "Let me help," said Alberg. "Come to my house, then. I'll make you some dinner. And then we can, do stuff." That night, Alberg edged past the overloaded bookcases in Cassandra's bedroom and stepped out into a net of luminous curiosity cast through her window by the moon. A tall, broad-shouldered figure, hair thick and tousled, his naked belly protruding, relaxed and vulnerable. Cassandra smiled to see this. She was a little surprised that he was fumbling his way through the darkness of her bedroom naked. He was usually quick to cover himself when they'd made love. "You're a sexy man, Karl Alberg," she said, watching his belly, and sure enough, he promptly sucked it in. She laughed out loud, and he pretended not to know why. Cassandra pulled the covers up to her chin and gazed at the moonlight, bright and substantive, and after a while Alberg returned with 2 squat glasses containing scotch over ice cubes. "Did the whole thing without turning on a light," he said. He settled himself on the bed on top of the covers, with a bunched-up pillow behind his head, his legs crossed at the ankles. "Oh, look at that," said Cassandra tenderly. "Look at your private parts, snoozing away there, all worn out. Aren't they sweet?" Hey, said Alberg uncomfortably. He pulled a chunk of bedspread over his genitals. "Get your eyes off my private parts." He slurped scotch with a clear conscience, knowing he was staying the night. "Karl," said Cassandra, "I have to tell you something." She figured she'd know when it was time, and now suddenly the time seemed to have come. Part of her wanted to balk, and for a moment she hesitated. "I really do," she said firmly, more to herself than to him. She hadn't told her mother yet. Shouldn't her mother be the first to know? She hadn't told her brother either. Screw this, she thought, just get on with it. "I've been thinking," she said, quite seriously, and Alberg had put down his glass, and now he turned to her. "Look at me." She looked at him. "Will you please marry me?" Cassandra stared at him, his face half in moonlight, half in shadow. She reached out and smoothed his pale hair away from his forehead. Such a tranquil face, unlined, unreadable, but his eyes sometimes gave him away. "What are you doing, Karl?" "I'm saying I want us to get married." "Why?" She realized that they were whispering. No, not both of them, just her. She said it again, louder. "Why?" "I want us to be together." He was quite tense, she realized. "Why now, Karl?" "I don't know why now. Why not now? If you mean why not earlier, I don't know." He took her hand and stroked it, looking at it attentively, as if it were her hand that would answer him. "I want us to have a porch swing." She pulled her hand away, threw back the covers, and swung her legs over the side of the bed. "Fuck," said Cassandra. She reached for her robe, lying in a heap on the floor, and put it on. Then she stood up and stalked out of the room. In the kitchen she stood fuming, looking out the window toward the Indian cemetery across the highway. She could see some of its white crosses glowing in the dark like fireflies. Would he get up, hurt and bewildered, and get dressed and quietly leave the house and quietly drive away? Or would he wait reproachfully in her bed for her to return and explain herself? She felt his arms slip around her from behind. He was still naked. "I don't want you to go," he said quietly. "What are you talking about?" "I don't want you to leave town." "I don't know what you're talking about. And even if you were right," she said, furious, "even if I was thinking about it, you've got no right to do something like this." "Sure I have," said Alberg, his arms firmly around her waist. "It's my life," said Cassandra, "and mine. Your life is my life, too, and my life is your life. That's what's happened to us." He turned her around. "That's why I'm asking you now instead of earlier. I didn't figure it out earlier." She pulled her robe more tightly around her. "This is a ridiculous conversation." "It's a very important conversation," said Alberg resolutely. Her eyes flickered down his body. "You look pretty stupid standing there buck naked trying to have an important conversation." She turned away. "Oh, Karl, don't complicate things." She tore a piece of paper toweling off the roll that hung under the cabinet and dabbed at her eyes. "Oh, shit. So what do you say?" Cassandra opened the cupboard under the sink and tossed the paper towel into the garbage. "I've never been married before, Karl. It's a very big deal to me." "It's a big deal to me, too, for Christ's sake." She turned and leaned against the sink. "We could try it out, I guess." "Try it out?" He sounded indignant. "We could, live together for a while and see how it works out." This possibility clearly had not occurred to him. "I don't know," he said reluctantly. Cassandra raised her eyebrows. "You don't know if you want to live with me? I thought you wanted to marry me, and now you don't know if you want to live with me?" I want to. It's just that, well, shit, how the hell would it look, for God's sake?" Cassandra stared at him. "You mean because you're a cop?" "Oh, for Christ's sake. Aren't cops allowed to live with people? Is there something in rules and regulations about not living with people? Does the RCMP tell you who you can bloody live with?" All right. The cold had seeped up through his body from his feet, bare on the tile floor of the kitchen. He shivered. Shit, he wanted his robe. "All right, we'll live together." "Good," said Cassandra briskly. "I'm glad that's settled." She looked at him with a certain amount of fondness. "You go get your robe. I'm going to make us a sandwich." Alberg plodded off to the bedroom. His good mood had vanished. He thought they'd buy a house together, he and Cassandra. He had even had his eyes on a couple. It seemed that was no go, at least for the moment. He picked up his robe from the end of the bed and put it on and slid his cold feet into his slippers. He gazed resentfully at the bookcases and wondered where the hell he'd find room in his small house for Cassandra's things. He tied the robe around his waist and headed back toward the kitchen. Maybe she could sublet, he thought. Bring only personal stuff with her. Still, even then, he only had the one closet. He He went into the kitchen where Cassandra had turned on the light and was peering into the fridge, looking for sandwich fixings. She turned to smile at him, and her smile was so open, so loving, her mouth so soft and inviting, that he felt himself stirring and wondered if maybe instead of eating... "When do you want to move in?" said Cassandra. Chapter 35. The next morning, Alberg was sitting on the stool in his kitchen, waiting for the lawyer in Phoenix to come back to the telephone. The weather had changed again, back to cold and gray and blustery. Alberg was in a snarly mood. It had something to do with Cassandra, of course, and something to do with his mother. He felt set upon by females, and wished that at least one of his offspring had been male. While he waited, he looked within himself for that dispassionate, crystalline substance that he thought of as his soul, as the essence of him. It wasn't very reliable. It was always coming and going. "Here I am back," said the lawyer. "Hi again," said Alberg politely. "You ever been down here?" said the lawyer, shuffling papers. "I've been to Tucson," said Alberg. "How'd you like it?" "I liked it." "Pretty nice up where you are, so I hear." "Yeah, it's pretty nice, all right," said Alberg, looking out at the broody gray sky, flicked with rain. "Okay, I found it," said the lawyer. "Here it is. She passed away on June 13th, 1991, aged 68. Poor woman. 68 isn't old. Not anymore. He said this with such firmness that Alberg was touched. "You're right," he agreed, smiling. "She got a blood clot on the brain, and poof, that was it. Well, it can happen. Now, let's see." Alberg drank some coffee. "Okay, right, yeah, that's what I thought. She'd had an estate worth $100,000, left the whole shebang to her only son, Charles Madison O'Bray. Has Mr. O'Bray claimed his inheritance?" "You betcha. Came down for the funeral, stayed a week or so, tied up all the loose ends, arranged for the sale of the real estate, transfer of the funds. I guess it was, let me see, yeah, about 6 months, early in December, when he actually got the money, just in time for Christmas. Probably got his wife one hell of a present, huh?" "You'd think so, wouldn't you?" said Alberg. "Where was it sent? To his account in Vancouver, I guess." "Right, Vancouver. To a bank in Vancouver." Alberg hung up and made some notes in his book. Then he pulled another handful of business cards from Nola King's fishbowl and started dialing. An hour later, no further ahead, he left his house, got into his car, and headed for the ferry terminal at Langdale. "I'm Karl Alberg," he said when she answered the door. "We spoke on the phone." He felt her hostility immediately. At first, she didn't even ask him in, but Alberg was perfectly willing to conduct the interview standing in the hallway, and when she realized that, she stalked into the living room and sat down. But not in the chair that was obviously her favorite. That was a bizarrely shaped contraption designed to fit the reclining body. And Ms. McAllister had no intention of relaxing in the presence of a cop, even one who wasn't on duty. There was a table next to this odd-looking chair, on which sat a lamp, a library book, an overflowing ashtray, a package of cigarettes, and a lighter. Also the remote control device for the television set. She scooped up the cigarettes and lighter before sitting in an easy chair next to the TV. Alberg settled onto the love seat. He felt weary, contemplating the effort it was clearly going to take to persuade this unfriendly woman to talk to him. He thought irritably about the long trip home, an hour or more to the ferry terminal, half an hour on the boat. Why the hell was he doing this anyway? Looking for a son of a bitch who didn't want to be found. A runaway husband who, what with his dead mother's legacy and various bonds and things, had scooted off with more than $200,000, enough to get him anywhere he wanted to go. A hell of a lot more than Emma could expect to get for the house he'd signed over to her. And now here he was, having to deal with this antagonistic woman. He struggled for patience. Then fuck it, he thought. Why did you agree to see me, he asked her. Because Emma asked me to see you. Do you think you have anything useful to tell me? Probably not, she said with satisfaction. She was wearing black and white checked pants, a white sweater, and a black jacket. Her hair was dark brown, and so were her eyes. She was in her late 20s. Okay, Alberg gave his thighs a light slap and stood up. Okay, what? Alberg headed for the door. Hey, she said, getting up to follow him. He opened the door. What's up? I thought you had things to ask me. See, said Alberg conversationally, I'm not on duty. This isn't my job I'm doing. It's a favor to a friend. And so I don't have to put up with any attitude I don't like. I don't have to put up with people who don't like cops. She leaned her hand on the edge of the door. Emma's your friend? No, a guy named Sid Sokolovsky's my friend. Is he Emma's friend? No, he's Emma's neighbor. Why are you doing it? Trying to find Charlie. Alberg looked into the hallway, which had pale green walls that needed painting, and indoor-outdoor carpeting in a peculiar shade of bronze. I'm curious about him. What's so odd about a guy leaving his wife? Nothing, that's the point. It happens all the time. So why make such a big deal out of it? Why cause yourself to vanish? Why not just say, Emma, I'm out of here? Lorraine stepped back from the door. You want a drink? They went back into the apartment. Lorraine poured herself a scotch and water and gave Alberg a Coke. I've been thinking about it, of course, she said, settling into her recliner chair. Why do you think he did it? Alberg, on the love seat, pulled out his notebook and pen. She shrugged. I guess he figured it was about time he did something for himself. What do you mean by that? In all the years they were married, the only thing Charlie ever did that was for him and not for Emma was to decide they'd live in Seashelt. She drank some of her scotch. Emma did not want to live in Seashelt. Oh, no. You know Charlie pretty well, do you? Yeah, pretty well. We grew up in the same neighborhood. Did he confide in you? You mean, did he tell me he was leaving Emma? She was shaking her head. No, absolutely not. Were you close? She said, shaking her head again. He was my oldest brother's friend, and when my brother died in a car crash about 6 years ago, Charlie got into the habit of calling me up now and then. Tell me about him. Tell you what? Anything, whatever comes to your mind. What's the point of this anyway? She said impatiently, lighting a cigarette. I want to get to know him. Yeah, but... Okay, so you get to know him, so you detect or whatever you do, and, hey, maybe you even find him. Then what? He'll just disappear again, I bet. Alberg looked at her thoughtfully. You've got a point, but I'm looking for him anyway. She dropped her lighter on the table next to the ashtray. Okay, I told Emma I'd cooperate, so I'll cooperate. Charlie O'Bray was an only child, Alberg learned, the son of an architect, who had died before Charlie got into his teens. His mother kept herself busy with an eclectic assortment of activities, including the Conservative Party. My parents were liberals, Lorraine McAllister told Alberg, and they used to hate to see her marching up the walk at election time. But between elections, my mom and Mrs. O'Bray were quite friendly, mostly because of Charlie and my brother Simon being friends. Okay, so anyway, we used to have this open house on Boxing Day. And this one year, I was about 12, I remember my mother was looking over the buffet table, making sure there was enough food and stuff there, and Mrs. O'Bray came up and started talking to her about Charlie. And she told Mom that Charlie had a girlfriend. And I think this time it's serious, Myrna, she tells my mom. And it turns out she's right. This woman, Joan her name was, she ends up marrying Charlie a year later. Wait a minute. Emma didn't tell you Charlie was divorced? Emma didn't tell me that, no, said Alberg, and Lorraine laughed. That's typical of Emma. What you don't think about doesn't exist. She's probably forgotten all about her. Seriously. She took another drink. Okay, like I said, her name was Joan. I forget her last name. She was a doctor. Well, is, I guess. Mrs. O'Bray didn't know how to take that exactly. Pretty non-traditional for Charlie O'Bray's mom to have a daughter-in-law who's a doctor. It didn't last long, though. They were divorced about the time I graduated from high school, so that's, let's see, no more than 5 or 6 years they were married. Do you know why they got divorced? Nope. Any kids? Nope. Okay. What then? I didn't see Charlie again for ages. Years. I was at UBC in 4th-year education when I ran into him in the Student Union building. He used to have a little business. He redid people's furniture for them, you know. People would bring him in old stuff, and he'd strip the wood bare and refinish it. He always liked working with his hands, Charlie did. Anyhow, so he got pretty depressed when his marriage broke up, I guess, and his mother was after him to go back to school, and finally he went. I don't think he wanted to, really, but it was something different to do, and it got his mother off his back. Did you know his mother well? I didn't like her much. Never wanted to get to know her well. Why didn't you like her? Oh, she was kind of pushy, and she gossiped a lot. Nothing serious. She stubbed out her cigarette. She moved to the States a few years ago. California, I think. Someplace warm, anyway. Okay, go on. You ran into Charlie when he went back to university, right? Right. He was in the MBA program, of all things, and I ended up introducing him to Emma. I guess that's why he figured he could complain to me about her later. What did he complain about? Oh, Charlie's a wimp, said Lorraine impatiently, getting another cigarette out of the package. He got exactly what he said he wanted, and then he found out he didn't want it after all. And so he complained all the time. Finally, I told him to take his damn whining somewhere else. She grinned and lit the cigarette. It worked, too. Haven't heard from him now in more than a year. What did he get that he decided he didn't want after all? You know that song, Someone to Watch Over Me? Well, that's what he got, in spades. Alberg thought about the living room in Emma's house, in which he could sense nobody's presence. He remembered the rage in Emma's face that day at the Sokolovskys when she'd watched him kissing Cassandra. Why didn't she want to live in Seashelt, he asked. Emma doesn't like small towns. She doesn't like boats or fishing or camping. Why the hell would she want to live on the Sunshine Coast? But Charlie did. Yeah, he loved it over there. I didn't see any fishing gear or camping stuff, no boat. Oh, they had all that once. He persuaded her to try it. Didn't work, though, so he sold it all, to Emma's great relief. She got up, cigarette in her mouth, squinting against the smoke, and took the overflowing ashtray into the kitchen to empty it. Then she sat down again. If he could afford to go anywhere in the world, said Alberg, where do you think Charlie would go? She meditated on this for a couple of minutes. You know, that's the sad part of it, for Charlie. He loved being right where he was, and in order to get Emma out of his life, he has to give it up. She looked at Alberg. I don't have any idea where he'd go. Alberg closed his notebook and got to his feet. Thanks for talking to me. I appreciate it. It's okay. You're not so bad for a cop. At the door, Alberg turned. I still don't understand why he didn't just ask her for a divorce. He probably did, but she'd never have given him one. Emma would never have let Charlie divorce her. But why? She held her cigarette behind her, so the smoke wouldn't drift into his face. It would have meant she'd failed. Emma hates to fail. Maybe it would have meant Charlie had failed, or both of them together. Yeah, said Lorraine, nodding, but there's no way Emma would see it that way. Back in his car, Alberg contemplated heading out to the airport with Charlie's photo. But that would be a waste of time, he decided. Without checking around first, finding out who was driving cabs and limos that day. He glanced at his watch. Too late to start digging into Charlie's first marriage. So he went home. He'd drop in to see Emma, give her hell about not mentioning Joan the doctor, and try to find out how many other things she wasn't revealing. But by the time he got back to Gibson's, he was too tired to drive on to Seashelt, so he sat down at the phone with another handful of business cards. An hour later, he got lucky. "Coastal flying." "Brad Watson, please," said Alberg. "You got him." "My name is Karl Alberg, Mr. Watson. I'm trying to locate a Charles O'Bray. I've got one of your business cards here. Do you—" "Charlie? Do I know Charlie O'Bray?" "Hell, yes. What do you mean you're trying to locate him?" Chapter 36. "Mother, I don't want to discuss it here." "You're the one who brought it up, Cassandra." Mrs. Mitchell took a pink dress from the rack and held it up to the light. "I didn't bring it up in here. They don't make clothes for women my age anymore. You brought it up on the way over here, and you knew this is where we were coming." "What do you think?" "I think it's a perfectly fine dress." "Maybe they never did make dresses for women my age. After all, I never looked for them before I got to this age." She replaced the pink dress and pushed hangers aside, looking critically at another dress, then another. "Once burned, twice shy. I guess that's his reasoning, is it?" "How about this?" Cassandra held up a pair of walking shorts. Her mother glanced at them. "Don't be ridiculous." "His first marriage didn't work out, and he's afraid to try again. That's it, isn't it?" She shook her head reproachfully. "You can do better, Cassandra." "I told you, Mother, it's my idea, not his." "How are you doing there, Helen?" said the owner of the dress shop, approaching with a smile. She was a tall, buxom woman with jet-black hair and extremely long fingernails. "Can I help you find something?" "Thank you, Margaret, but I'm just browsing." "Well, you just let me know if you need anything." Cassandra watched as her mother flicked her way through several racks of clothing. Cassandra had decided it would be wise to have this conversation in public, where her mother couldn't make too much of it. But it was occurring to her now that if she'd broken the news in the privacy of her mother's apartment, she'd at least be able to leave when she felt like it. "I can't concentrate on this," said Mrs. Mitchell abruptly. "My mind's wandering like a stray dog. Let's go have some tea." They crossed the street and entered a small cafe that Mrs. Mitchell favored because of its white tablecloths. She chose a table by the window and ordered tea and scones. "I wish you didn't disapprove of practically everything I do," said Cassandra. "Don't bother to tell me what you do," said her mother crossly, "if you aren't interested in getting my honest opinion." "You're my mother," said Cassandra. "What am I going to do, let you find out from somebody else?" "The whole town's going to be talking about this, that's for sure." "I doubt it. It's not a big deal, Mother." Mrs. Mitchell fixed an unseeing gaze beyond Cassandra out to the street. She was looking well, despite the pain Cassandra knew she suffered from her arthritis. Her hair was almost completely white now, still worn in a page boy, with bangs. "I do not understand why you're doing it," she said, after a minute shaking her head. "Oh, God, Mother." Cassandra rummaged through her handbag, looking for aspirin. "I told you I don't know if I want to marry him or not." "Oh, I understand that part of it." Mrs. Mitchell paused, while the waitress set down cups and saucers, a small brown teapot, and a plate of hot buttered scones. "Enjoy," said the waitress. "Thank you," said Mrs. Mitchell. "What are you looking for?" she said to Cassandra. "Aspirin." "What I don't understand is what you think you're going to find out living with him that you don't already know." Mrs. Mitchell leaned closer and lowered her voice. "You two must have, slept together by now." haven't you?" Cassandra set down her water glass and felt herself flush. "It's not that." Mrs. Mitchell poured a little tea into one of the cups. "Then what is it?" "Mother, I've lived alone for years. It might be too late for me to live with someone else." "Aren't you going to pour that tea?" "It's still too weak." "I like mine weak." She reached for the pot and filled her cup. She wouldn't have anything to eat. She didn't need it. Fortunately, she wasn't even hungry. Mrs. Mitchell stared out the window. Finally, she sighed and picked up half a scone. "I know it's a commonplace thing now, people living together without benefit of clergy. But it's a thing I will never get used to." She began eating. "He lives in Gibson's, doesn't he? So I won't see as much of you in the future." "You'll see as much of me as you ever did. I work here, after all," said Cassandra. Butter had dripped from the scones and was pooling on the plate. "And besides, I want us to live in my house." Her mother looked at her in amazement. "That tiny place?" "It's not a tiny place. There's plenty of room in it." "How does he feel about it?" "He's got a name, Mother," said Cassandra sharply. "How does Karl feel about it, living in your house?" "He's a bit... He's thinking about it." She picked up a scone, put it down again. "Is his place any bigger?" "No." Her mother examined Cassandra thoughtfully. "I like your hair short like that, and you've certainly lost a lot of weight." "I'm feeling good these days," Cassandra confessed. "It's steady work being a policeman," her mother went on. "And it's true you aren't getting any younger." "We're none of us getting any younger, Mom." Cassandra picked up the scone again and took a bite. Chapter 37. Eddie's sister Sylvia was a single mom with 2 little kids, a boy and a girl, who were 5 and 4 and looked a lot alike. She cut their hair the same, which Eddie didn't approve of. He thought boys should look like boys and girls should look like girls, and the way they did their hair had a lot to do with this. Sylvia was too casual about stuff like that. She parted their hair on the side and cut them bangs, and then evened it up around the bottom, just below their ears. They looked like twins. People on the street always figured they were twins, and usually people thought they were the same sex, too. So whenever Eddie took them anywhere, he always put a barrette in Edith's hair and messed up Will's. Will was named after the prince who might be the King of England one day. Eddie didn't know who Edith was named after. Sylvia was working days this week at the gas station on 10th, where she'd had a job for a couple of years now. She had an arrangement with a friend. Sylvia looked after the friend's kids, and the friend looked after hers. But sometimes this wasn't possible because they were both working at the same time. Then she had a list of babysitters she used, but today it turned out they were all busy doing something else, so she'd ask Eddie to pitch in. She hardly ever asked him to help out, but he didn't mind it when she did. She'd done a lot for him in his life, Sylvia had. And besides, he kind of liked her kids. Well, no, he actually loved her kids. He tried to find a skirt for Edith to wear, but she didn't seem to have any. "Edith," he called out from inside the kids' closet, "where are your skirts?" Edith just laughed. So he left her in her jeans, but he found the orange barrette he'd brought one day about a month ago and stuck that in her hair. And then he took the kids by the hand and walked down to the end of Sylvia's block to a big scoop and bought them an ice cream sundae. They thought this was pretty exciting, in the middle of the morning. "How about going for a little walk, fellas?" he said when they were back out on the street. "Okay," said Will. Edith let go of his hand and ran a few steps ahead. "Where to? Where to?" "Only a little ways," said Eddie, "because then we've got to get back and make us some lunch." He'd found that the best way to entertain Sylvia's kids was to keep them eating all the time. "What are we having? "What are we having?" said Edith, hopping backward down the street in front of him. "Come on back here, hold my hand," said Eddie sternly. "Can we have Chef Boyardee?" said Edith. "We don't got any," said Will. "Can we get some?" said Edith. "You get over here and hold on to my hand," said Eddie, "and then maybe we'll go to the store and get some Chef Boyardee. Otherwise, you are out of luck, Edith." Edith slipped her hand into his and skipped along next to him. He steered the kids around the next corner. It was in his mind to wander past Melanie's house a few blocks away. He couldn't spend any more time doing surveillance, because even in an indifferent neighborhood like that one, somebody was going to notice if the same guy was there every day. He had to get busy and take action, he knew that, but he was having a hard time working up his nerve. He longed to confer again with Gardner, except that he was reluctant to face more of Gardner's impatient contempt for the way he, Eddie, was handling things. He'd looked her up in the phone book because she hadn't been. That is, the accident only happened 10 days ago, and so she'd still be in it, and she was. And he started phoning every so often, like several times a day, to make sure the girls were still there. He'd been sorely tempted sometimes, when they answered, just to blurt it out. "Where's the box?" he might say, and who knows, they might blurt out where it was right back to him. But he never did this, naturally. He just listened. "Hello? Hello?" And then they'd hang up. After he'd phoned a few times, they started swearing at him, though they didn't know who they were swearing at, and then after that he just got the stupid answering machine, so he stopped phoning then. "Where are we going?" said Will, sounding worried. "Just to the end of this block," said Eddie. He'd herded them across the street, and now they were approaching the house on the opposite sidewalk. The old gray Reliant was parked out in front, wedged in between a Honda Civic and a Ford pickup, and the Reliant's roof rack was piled with luggage. "Come on, Eddie," said Edith, pulling at his hand. "Hurry up, you slowpoke, you." The dark-haired roommate burst through the hole in the hedge, carrying a carton that had printed on the top in big red letters, "Melanie." She was followed by the other two girls, and each of them had a box marked Melanie, too. "Oh, shit," said Eddie under his breath. But Edith heard him and made a big to-do about his bad language. He hustled them along, his head averted, and he didn't sneak a glance back until they'd gotten to the corner. They were tying the luggage onto the roof rack and shoving more stuff into the back seat. "Oh, shit," said Eddie again. He hurried the kids around the corner and along the adjacent street to 4th Avenue, where they stopped at a store to get Chef Boyardee and a package of cake donuts. When they got back to Sylvia's house, he called Gardner, who took a long time getting to the phone, and then sounded sullen and unfriendly. But he agreed to come over. Eddie let the kids play out in the back yard, while he and Gardner talked on the porch, keeping their voices low so the kids couldn't hear them. "Okay, so give me the story," said Gardner, whose spirits had improved. "Tell me the tale." "So it says in the letter," Eddie told him, while Will played with his toy marines in the sandbox, and Edith swung on the tire Eddie had hung last summer from the bottom branch of the big maple tree. "It says they've been offered these jobs, see, in Seashelt, and it says they got to make up their minds by the end of the week if they're going to go or not. So today I see them loading up their car, see, and I damn know that's what they're doing. They're going to damn Seashelt, and they're taking her stuff with them in those cartons, and my notes are in there. They gotta be." "What the fuck's a Seashelt?" said Gardner, digging at earwax with his little finger. "It's a place," said Eddie, "up the coast. You gotta get a ferry." "Oh, shit, ferries. I hate ferries." "Watch your language, will you?" said Eddie, pointing with his thumb to the kids. Gardner yawned and stretched, standing up. He leaned on the porch railing. "Hey, kid," he called out. Will, who who was squatting in the sandbox with his back to them, looked at Gardner over his shoulder. Edith, hanging upside down, peered at him through the hole in the tire. "What?" said Harry finally. "I forget." He sat down again, next to Eddie on the top step. "What the hell's the matter with you?" said Eddie. "If they were going to give you trouble with those fucking notes, they would have done it by now. Shit, they probably burned them, tore them up. No way they'd keep them. Why the fuck would they keep them?" Eddie shook his head worriedly. "I don't trust them. Maybe they're waiting till they get out of town to give me trouble. Maybe they saw me watching the house and got scared. Whatever, Gardner. I just don't trust the bitches, you know." Okay, let me think," said Gardner, leaning on his knees, his hands loosely clasped between them. Edith had gotten off the tire and was now scratching letters in the dirt with a stick. Eddie, watching, remembered doing that himself when he was a kid. He wished there was some lawn back here for Sylvia's kids to play on, but the maple tree was so big that the whole yard was in shadow most of the time. And what with that, and kids playing on it, the ground just didn't let grass grow there. "Well, the way I see it," said Gardner, "it's got to be easy pickings." "Oh, yeah, sure," said Eddie sarcastically. "Right, easy pickings, sure." "Well, shit, there's fucking cartons with their fucking name on them in red letters, right? You can't hardly miss the fucking things." Eddie stared at him, exasperated. "They're on their damn way to Seashelt, Gardner. Didn't you hear me?" Gardner grinned at him. He grabbed Eddie's cheeks in his hands. "So are we, Weasel. So are we." "Shit," said Eddie, knocking his hands away. "Quit that." Gardner got to his feet. "I wouldn't do this for just anybody," he said, sticking his hands in his pockets. "Fucking fairies. I hate fairies." "Hey, kid," he said, ambling down the steps toward the sandbox. "Can I play?" Chapter 38. Alberg set out from his house in Gibson's the next morning filled with expectation, focused and exhilarated. He drove up the highway from Gibson's on a day that was cool and sunny with a good breeze off the ocean. His life had for the moment stepped back from him, and he was not intruded upon by thoughts of living with Cassandra, or trading in his car, or buying a boat, or renovating his small house, or caring better for his aging body. He drove north in a state of controlled excitement, thinking only about Charlie O'Bray. He wasn't angry with Charlie, but he had decided that Charlie must explain himself to Emma. There was usually nothing at all judgmental in the way Alberg went about doing his work. Judgment was other people's business. He always said, the court's business. But of course he had opinions, and this time, since he wasn't operating as a police officer, he was allowing his opinions to assume a greater importance in his decision-making. He drove the familiar road to Seashelt, through the town and out the other side, and then north to Half Moon Bay and beyond. Eventually the road turned and descended, and below lay Ruby Lake. There was a motel and restaurant on the right side of the road, next to a pond, and the lake proper was on the left. As he drove toward it down the curving highway, he saw a float plane moored snugly against the shore. Alberg slowed and pulled off the road. He parked in the empty lot in front of the restaurant, walked across the highway, and sat for a while on a large rock next to the water. He studied the float plane, white with red markings, and noticed that moorages were scattered along the shoreline as far as he could see. The rock on which he sat was shale, and it extended beneath the clear green water. There was a small round island out there, and a larger one, more oval in shape, beyond it. The breeze was soft and soundless. After a while, Alberg got up across the highway again and went into the restaurant. He sat at the counter and ordered a coffee. The proprietor was wearing jeans and a plaid flannel shirt. He put the coffee in front of Alberg, placed his palms on the countertop, and stared into Alberg's face. Alberg smiled at him. "I keep a packed suitcase in my car," said Charlie O'Bray, "and I know the ferry schedules by heart." "You probably wouldn't take a ferry, though," said Alberg. "You'd probably fly out of here, in your float plane over there." Charlie had been severely jolted by the sight of Alberg trudging across the gravel. He caught sight of him when Alberg was still several yards from the door. He thought about running. He could ease out the back way, tell Paula in the kitchen that he was feeling sick. Yeah, that was a perfectly good, workable idea. But he didn't do it. A powerful lethargy seized him, and he found himself watching almost calmly as Alberg got nearer and nearer, opened the screen door, and came inside. And when Charlie got a look at Alberg's expression, he knew it wouldn't have done him any good to run. The guy wasn't here on some kind of highway patrol coffee break. The guy wasn't accidentally discovering Charlie here. The guy had known right where to look for him. Charlie asked Paula to keep an eye open for customers, and he and Alberg went outside. "Why didn't you just divorce her?" Charlie almost laughed. "Well, I tried that, officer," he said, "but she wouldn't let me." "Why?" "Oh, Jesus, Alberg." Furious, Charlie rubbed at his hair with both hands. They were sitting outdoors on iron chairs, from which the white paint was flecking. The cushions were stained and damp. Charlie loved the tired-looking chairs. He loved the rain-marked cushions. He loved the whole miserable, falling-down place. He was going to make it beautiful again, and profitable, too. But he wondered if he'd be able to keep it now. He glanced at the off-duty cop, who'd made it his business to find Emma's errant husband. "I'm a simple man," he told Alberg earnestly. "I like simple pleasures." "Uh-huh." "I've got simple dreams," said Charlie, warming to his tale, and to Alberg's attentiveness. "Always have had. The insurance business, that was a deviation from the norm. All my life," he said, crossing his arms, enjoying the tinge of grief in his voice, "I've been buffeted by the aims and ambitions of women." "Bullshit." Charlie winced. He looked out at the pond and the highway that wound down toward them from the south. The two men sat in silence for a while. The willow trees by the edge of the water were green gold with new leaves. "I almost killed her," he said heavily. "That's why I left her." "What do you mean?" "I mean I held a Smith & Wesson to her head and damn near pulled the trigger. That's what I mean. And then I knew I had to get out of there, out of the house, the job, the marriage." He leaned forward, hands clasped, elbows resting on his knees. "I was unfaithful to her, and she still wouldn't let me go. I was her career. I was her damn life's work." He sat up. "She's very sweet, Emma is, but she's wrong about a lot of things." "When did this happen, this incident with the firearm?" Charlie stared at him disbelievingly. "This incident with the firearm? Is that how you guys really talk?" He shook his head. "A year ago." "Why didn't you leave right away?" "I wanted to know where I was going and what I was going to do when I got there," Charlie snapped. "I had to have some kind of a plan." He slumped back in his chair. "And then my mother died. All of a sudden, about 6 months ago, I had money. It sounds crass, I know. How did you keep Emma from finding out your mother was dead?" "I just didn't tell her. They never got along anyway, so it's not as though I had to worry about Emma writing to her or calling her up." "What then?" said Alberg. "What did you do next?" "You know what I did. I took flying lessons. And then I bought that float plane, and I put a down payment on this place." He looked at Alberg curiously. "How did you know to come here?" "You filed a flight plan." "Yeah," Charlie sighed and laughed. "So I did." "How come you didn't get yourself a new ID?" "I wouldn't have known how to go about it," said Charlie, gazing across the highway at the lake. sunlight sparkling from its blue-green surface. "You could have found out, though." "Yeah, well, I didn't want to be anybody else. I wanted to be me again, finally." "Were you," said Alberg dryly, "with your first wife?" Charlie laughed again. "I tried to be, but we were just too different to make things work. I wanted a home and kids, but Joan, there was no way she was going to take a year out of her life to have a kid. To her, marriage was like something she kept in her purse, you know? Like a book you haul out to read when you're stuck in traffic. Something to do when her career slowed down for a minute." "But Emma wasn't like that." "No," said Charlie softly. "No, Emma wasn't like that." He remembered the first time he'd seen her, on the stage at UBC, in a play. He couldn't remember anything about the play, except Emma, who was so beautiful he'd found himself unable to take deep breaths. Emma really wanted to be married. And she was sexy, too, as well as beautiful and smart. No, more than sexy. She was wanton. She was seductive. She was insatiable. At least, so it had seemed. Charlie stood up and went to the rickety pier that led out into the pond. "Someday all this is going to be landscaped," he said, with a gesture that took in the weedy, scrabbly terrain that stretched between the pond and the motel units. "I'm going to do it all myself." They'd made love under a blanket on the ferry, and on a gravel beach, and in the back of the car. They'd done it on the kitchen table, and in the shower, and on the floor in front of the fireplace. Emma said she loved sex. Emma couldn't get enough sex. She didn't want to do anything else except be married, he said dreamily to Alberg. Just wanted to be married. Just wanted to take care of the house and the garden and the household finances. And me. He looked up the hill to the south. There wasn't much traffic this time of year. Things would get busier in a few weeks, though. He had a lot to do to get ready for the tourist season. Cleaning, repairs, gardening. "And that was exactly what you wanted, right?" said Alberg irritably. "Yeah," said Charlie. He knew the exact moment in which his marriage had started to die. It happened 18 months after the wedding. He and Emma were coming out of a restaurant in Vancouver. He'd taken Emma's hand and glanced at her, and he'd seen desire in her face, shimmering from her skin, which was pale, diaphanous. He was tremendously excited. Out on the street he'd taken her around the corner into an alley and pushed her against the wall. He pulled up her dress. She undid his fly. She bent her knees and thrust herself forward, and Charlie pinned her arms against the wall. Her mouth opened for his tongue as he entered her. When they were finished, Emma adjusted her clothing and combed her hair with her fingers and leaned down to brush at the toe of her shoe. Charlie, gazing unseeingly at Alberg, remembered that she had been wearing black patent leather pumps. Light from the street lamp at the corner caught on her face. It was utterly blank, dispassionate, and Charlie realized that it wasn't desire he'd seen on her face. It was hot in the restaurant. She was just sweating a little. "Yeah, she was exactly what I thought I wanted." He shoved his hands in the pockets of his jeans. A car pulled off the highway onto the gravel and parked next to Alberg's. She had been presenting herself to him, he'd realized, in the coming days and months, like a series of portraits, each one charming, delightful, but one-dimensional. Charlie shrugged. "Emma got too enthusiastic about being a wife, that's all," he said, watching a couple with 2 small children go through the screen door into the restaurant. After the incident in the alley, Charlie had started talking to himself in the bathroom mirror. He'd wipe away the steam from his shower and stare at his reflection, making faces, and babble away at himself. This shook him up quite a lot. "What do you mean?" said Alberg. Charlie looked at him for a moment. "Why the hell am I talking to you anyway?" Alberg grinned at him. "I've been wondering that myself. Charlie studied him. Alberg looked like an easy-going type of guy, a little wary, but that must go with the job. "You probably needed to talk," said Alberg, "and I'm probably the first likely candidate that's come along." "How much is she paying you?" Alberg looked surprised. "Nothing." "You're doing this as a favor? For somebody you barely know?" Now the cop looked uncomfortable. "Not exactly. I'm on leave. It was something to do, and then I got interested." Charlie nodded slowly. "Okay, I don't think I've got anything more to say, though." They sat quietly for a while, looking at the water, listening to the birds and the far-off sound of a powerboat. Alberg thought there was probably a lot more to Charlie's story. He got up and began walking toward the parking area, Charlie following. "The revolver," he said, "is it registered?" "No," said Charlie. "I never got around to it." He glanced at Alberg. "Hell, I've had it for years. It was my dad's. It was just a keepsake, you know." "You brought it to Ruby Lake with you?" "No, I left it behind." They reached the car. Alberg unlocked the driver's door and opened it. "Listen, are you going to tell her where I am?" "Not right away," said Alberg. He looked at Charlie. "But I want you to get in touch with her. She deserves some kind of explanation. I plan to write her a letter every time I sit down to do it." He rubbed his hands together. "I will, though. You've got a week." Alberg started to get into the car, then stopped and turned back to Charlie. "Is there ammunition, too? For the Smith & Wesson?" "Yeah," said Charlie after a minute. "Why?" "I think I'll drop in," said Alberg, getting into his car, "and talk to her about permits." Chapter 39. Such a short time ago, thought Emma, sitting in her kitchen, marveling. Only 2 weeks ago, in fact, she would have been sitting here planning the evening meal, pondering momentous decisions like pasta versus pot roast, salad versus soup. Shall we eat at the dining room table or in front of the TV set? That would have depended on whether there was a hockey game or something important on the news. Charlie always got home in time for the 6 o'clock news. He was as regular as clockwork, as dependable as the sunrise. He hadn't always been regular and dependable. He'd become so, though, after Helena. Emma hadn't known the names of the others, and she didn't think Helena was any more important to him than the others had been. But Emma had met Helena, who had been the last, so of course she had known her name. Emma had been much taken aback by the look of her. She was a skinny young woman with hair so short it made her head look the size of a marble. She wasn't at all attractive. Emma had found her easily by following Charlie. She was surprised at how easy it was to follow Charlie. It didn't seem to have occurred to him that she might do this, but she did. Helena worked in a chiropractor's office, in the building that also housed Charlie's consulting firm. Emma followed Helena then and learned all sorts of things about her. She went to church most Sundays. Her hypocrisy, thought Emma, was limitless. She visited her parents in Surrey once or twice a month. She sang in one of the city's major choirs. Emma followed her several times over several months, working on a plan. One day Emma followed her home from work and went to a nearby restaurant and had a sandwich. At about 6:30 she went to Helena's apartment in the house on West 7th Avenue and knocked on the door. "Hello," she said warmly when Helena answered. She held up a clipboard and a file folder. "I'm doing a survey for City Hall," she said, "on the importance of municipal funding to cultural organizations. Could I possibly have a few moments of your time?" Yes, Charlie had changed all right after Helena, thought Emma. The revolver lay on the kitchen table in front of her. She pushed it away from her, using the index finger of her right hand, then hooked her finger inside the trigger guard and pulled it back toward her. What if I had a dinner party, she thought, and began composing a guest list. She'd invite Lorraine and the Sokolovskys next door. She could invite Karl Alberg, too. She got up and went into the bedroom and looked through the glass doors into the backyard, hands shoved into the pockets of the oversized cardigan she was wearing over jeans and a denim shirt. She'd recreate the menu from the anniversary dinner, she decided. She'd use the best china and the silver. She saw herself setting 6 places, 1 for Charlie. She saw crystal glittering in candlelight, white linen glowing, silver gleaming, and this image led to thoughts of Charlie's mother, who had given them silverware as a wedding gift. Charlie's mother would know by now of his disappearance, thought Emma, hurrying back to the kitchen. Alberg would have told her. She wondered why she hadn't yet heard from Alberg about this, since he'd reported to her promptly about everything else. And she would have expected a call from her mother-in-law, too, she thought, reaching for the phone. An image popped into her head, full-blown, like a photograph hung suddenly in the air before her. Charlie and his mother were sitting side by side on a long sofa, upholstered in fabric with a dark background, maroon, with large flowers splashed on it. There were lace antimacassars on its back and arms. Charlie's head was resting on his mother's shoulder. She was sitting tall and straight, with her right arm around him. Charlie's hands were in his lap. Mrs. O'Bray, knees primly together, had on a white dress with small blue polka dots, and her white hair was soft and wavy. On her feet were dark blue shoes with low heels. Charlie's dark hair gleamed. He was wearing a white shirt, open at the throat, and an apple-green pullover vest and a pair of pants the color of butterscotch. They were both looking directly at Emma, unsmiling, unmoving. Emma, rattled, quickly dialed her mother-in-law's number. "I'm sorry," said a recorded female voice. "That number is no longer in service." Emma wondered if the voice was a real person or a computer. She sat down heavily, convinced that Charlie was in Arizona. She thought about what she ought to do. She wanted to rush directly to the Vancouver airport and climb onto the first available flight to Phoenix. But the number was out of service. What did that mean? Maybe they've gone, she thought. Scuttled away from there, gone to South America, or Tanzania, or New Zealand, or someplace. Emma hurried upstairs to Charlie's desk and started rummaging through the drawers. Someday she'd have to dispose of all this stuff. She imagined setting it on fire, right here, making a big pile of all this paper right on top of the desk and putting a match to it. To hell with him, she thought, feeling reckless. He isn't the only one who can start all over again. She slammed the bottom desk drawer shut and turned to the filing cabinet. There wasn't much there. Catalogs, said one folder. Documents, said another. In there was their marriage license and birth certificates and Charlie's expired passport. House, said another folder. Insurance. Emma had been through all of them. Finally, mother. She took this folder into the kitchen and dumped the contents out on the table. A pile of letters written over several years, and started reading them, looking for clues. She found references to her mother-in-law's sister and remembered that the woman lived in Brandon, Manitoba. Emma dialed 1-204-555-1212. Operator, I'd like a number in Brandon, please. Chapter 40. Sanducci was enjoying his 30s. He acknowledged this to himself, somewhat surprised about it, as he turned off Roberts Creek Road onto the highway. He was even beginning to give serious thought to finding a nice girl and settling down. Unbelievable. He was returning to the detachment in Sechelt from a routine investigation into a car theft. The victim was a single mother whose 10-year-old Toyota had vanished from her driveway during the night. The corporal was feeling pretty good about life, all things considered. He was due to be transferred, and he didn't like that much. He would miss the Sunshine Coast. But the move would provide a smooth, tidy way to end things with Roxanne, so he wasn't entirely unhappy about it. Roxanne Baker had been his steady girlfriend for a year now, and although it had at times been excruciatingly difficult, he had actually managed to remain faithful to her. He was proud of himself. There was a dearth of public transportation in Seashelt, and that single mom was really going to feel the absence of her vehicle. She needed it every day. She'd told Sanducci to take her kid to daycare and to get herself back and forth to work. She had veered during the interview between despair and a rage so towering that Sanducci had become alarmed. He'd never been serious about Roxanne, but he was serious about getting serious about somebody. The relationship had been invaluable preparation. What a relief to know that monogamy was actually possible. For a year, anyway. And a year was a very long time, he told himself. He'd see if he couldn't rustle up some wheels for the single mother, he thought, pulling out to pass a heavy-laden logging truck, laboring along at 30 kilometers per hour. He figured they'd find the Toyota all right. Some kids had probably gone joyriding in it, and they'd leave it in the bush somewhere when they were done, or maybe in the shopping center parking lot, if they were cocky enough, but the woman couldn't put her life on hold in the meantime. He'd had a good year with Roxanne. He hadn't spent so much time with one particular female person since he'd gone steady with Angela Giovando, way back in high school. When you saw that much of somebody, you couldn't spend all your time in the sack. He'd learned all kinds of things in conversations with Roxanne, who was a medical secretary. The trees on either side of the highway were a green color so bright it glowed almost like neon, thought Sanducci as he came up behind a gray Plymouth Reliant, even on a day like this, when the sun kept disappearing. The Reliant had a roof rack that was laden with suitcases. He couldn't make out how many people were inside. In the back window was a pile of flowers. Sanducci grinned to himself, because the Reliant slowed down in a hurry when the driver saw his patrol car. He decided to just sit there for a while, 2 car lengths back, doing a steady 60K. He loved it that traffic slowed to the limit whenever they spotted a patrol car, and he got royally pissed off every time some macho stud-jerk shit-rat got all defiant at the sight of him and gunned it, giving Sanducci the metaphorical finger. Usually he managed to restrain himself when this happened. He'd radio the guy's plate up ahead. But sometimes he wanted so badly to take off after the son of a bitch. The flowers bouncing around in the back window of the Reliant looked familiar. One kind looked like fruit tree blossoms of some sort, little flowers, dark pink ones, in clusters along branches. "Flowering quince," he said aloud, snapping his fingers. He beamed behind his sunglasses. Roxanne's folks had a big bush of it in their front yard. Flowering quince. He leaned toward the windshield, peering more closely into the Reliant, trying to see what the other flowers were. Big yellow ones. Oh, boy, he thought. He turned on the light bar and punched a brief howl out of the siren, pulling the Reliant over. He picked up his peaked service cap and fitted it on over his thick curly hair, opened his door, and ambled over to the small gray car, which had come to a stop on the shoulder of the highway. The driver had rolled down her window and was looking at him impatiently. "What's your problem?" she said. There were 3 women in the car and a lot of luggage. The women, all in their early 20s, were dressed casually in jeans and sweaters. The one in the back seat had been lying down, but she sat up now, observing Sanducci with suspicion. "Good afternoon, ma'am," said Sanducci with a wide smile. He wished he'd left his dark glasses in the patrol car. The sun had gone away again. "What is it?" said the driver. You've been following us for 5 miles. You know damn well we haven't exceeded the limit." "You're right," he said, still smiling. The person in the seat next to the driver was red-haired, with very pale skin. Sanducci figured she'd have to be real careful of the sun. The woman in the back had light brown hair that was a mass of waves falling down upon her shoulders. "Well, what the hell do you want, then?" said the driver. Her dark hair fell to her jaw on one side and was clipped above her ear on the other. Sanducci liked this effect very much. He decided she was by far the most attractive of the three. "Actually, ma'am, I pulled you over because of those flowers back there." "I told you, Kathy," said the young woman in the back seat. "I told you we shouldn't have taken them." She looked strong and capable, and Sanducci was amazed when she burst into tears. Sanducci, dumbfounded, looked from one young woman to another. "Hey, it's okay, really." He looked left and right along the highway, thinking about a police harassment. The girl next to the driver turned to look into the back seat. "Oh, stop it, Caroline," she said wearily, brushing at the strands of hair that had come loose from her ponytail. "We'll pay the fine," the driver said to Sanducci. "Just give me the damn ticket." "Ma'am, there isn't any fine," said Sanducci. "There isn't any ticket. Listen, I only stopped you because... those yellow ones, see them?" "They're water lilies," she said. "Caroline, please." The sobbing abated. We get upset sometimes. Can't seem to do anything about it." The driver rubbed her forehead as if she had a headache. "A friend of ours," said the redhead. "Our roommate." "Shh," said the driver impatiently. She looked up at the corporal. "So, can we go or what?" "Well, see, the trouble is, those aren't water lilies. They're skunk cabbages." All three of them looked at him as if he were deranged. "They're what?" said the driver. "Skunk cabbages. I know they're very pretty, but believe me, if you leave them back there, your car's going to stink like hell in a little while." The driver stared at him. Then, "Caroline," she said, "hand over those water lilies." The girl in the back collected the bulbous yellow blooms and handed them to the driver, who started to open her door. "I'll take care of them," said the corporal. She thrust the skunk cabbages through the window into his outstretched hands. "Thanks." There came an angry outburst from the redhead in the passenger seat. "What do you think you're doing, anyway, pulling people over? Skunk cabbages, for God's sake. Haven't you got better things to do?" Her face was flushed, and her hands had curled themselves into fists. "I know you've got better things to do, so go and do it." "Sandy," said the driver, "don't." She turned back to the corporal. "What's your name, officer?" He noticed that a wind had come up. "Sanducci." "Your first name, I mean." Sanducci hesitated. "Eduardo." The driver tilted her head to study him. Her hair fell away from her face like a dark, curved wing. "Eduardo," she nodded. "It suits you." Sanducci smelled blossoms on the wind, or maybe it was the girl's perfume drifting toward him through the cool spring day. "We've had a bad thing happen in our lives, Eduardo. A calamity." The other two were watching her, as if hypnotized. "I'm very sorry to hear that." "And as a result, we aren't ourselves these days." She glanced into the back seat. "That's Caroline back there." She indicated the girl sitting next to her. "This is Sandra." She pointed to herself. "I'm Kathy." "How do you do?" said Sanducci. A few raindrops spattered onto the car. "We go to UBC. We've got summer jobs over here." Sanducci found himself listening intently, awaiting epiphany, or at least revelation. But if she'd been about to confide in him, or request his assistance, she changed her mind. "Thank you again," said Kathy abruptly, and she cranked up the window, started the car, and moved off onto the highway, leaving Sanducci standing by the side of the road with a heart full of wonder and an armful of skunk cabbages. Chapter 41. On Saturday morning, Emma, awoke early. She got dressed quickly and sat in front of the TV set, watching News World, until she thought it was late enough to go looking for Alberg. But when she opened the front door, he was standing on her porch, about to ring the bell. "I was just going to see you," said Emma severely, "and here I am." He wasn't smiling. He looked quite grim, and not a bit guilty. She led him into the living room. "Why didn't you tell me she was dead?" "I've got a question for you, too," said Alberg. "Why didn't you tell me?" Emma insisted. "I felt like an idiot on the phone to that woman, a person I've never met, who'll be wondering forever why on earth I didn't know my own mother-in-law had died." "Can we sit down?" said Alberg. "I don't want to sit down." Alberg studied her for a moment, and Emma didn't like that at all. His pale blue gaze swept across her face like a cold breeze, and she became uncertain of his capacity for compassion. "Where's the revolver, Emma?" he said. Instantly she looked behind him, toward the front door. She thought about the gun in the night table drawer. She pressed her hand against her chest to calm her heart. "You found him," Emma said finally. Alberg watched her and said nothing. "Where is he?" He shook his head. "Where is he? My God, you've got to tell me. You can't do all this work and find him, and then not to tell me where he is." "He's going to get in touch with you." Emma's entire body was shaking. It felt extremely violent. "Where is he?" "I told you he'll be in touch." "Oh, to hell with that. To hell with him. To hell with him. To hell with you." She looked around for something to throw at him. "He'll be in touch. He'll be in touch." She wanted to heave the bookcase at him, squashing him underneath it, but it was too heavy, and she was too weak because of the trembling. She whirled around and hurried out of the house. He was calling her name, but she ignored him. She got to her car before she realized she didn't have her purse, and therefore didn't have her car keys. He caught up with her there. "Emma, I'm sorry. I promise you. He will be calling you, or writing. If you haven't heard from him in a week, I'll tell you where he is." She needed time to calm herself, to think, to work things out. She took a deep breath and smoothed her hair with both hands. "Okay. Emma, the revolver. It's an unregistered, restricted firearm." "Oh, I don't have that damn thing." She turned to look at him, keeping her face relaxed. "I assume Charlie told you about... Well, did he? About when he pointed the damn thing at me?" "Yes, he did." "I couldn't possibly have it in my house." She shuddered. "I found it, and I chucked it out with the trash." She could tell that he didn't know whether to believe her or not, and that in either case he was not happy. "I have to know exactly when you did this," he said quietly. "We have to try to recover it." "Really?" said Emma with interest. "I take firearms extremely seriously, Emma." "My goodness, Karl," she said, looking him in the face. "So do I." Chapter 42. Later that day, Emma, wearing old jeans and a sweatshirt, marched outside and pawed aimlessly in the garden with a three-pronged fork for a while. Then she dragged out the lawnmower and cut the grass, wiped off the outdoor furniture, swept the patio, watered the hanging baskets. When there was nothing more to do, she went to the back of the yard and leaned on the cedar fence. It was a mild day, a benevolent day. Emma could see the ocean 2 blocks away and smell it in the spring breeze that blew gently from the west. The lilac in the corner of the yard was fragrant with deep purple blossoms. Emma, exhausted, rested her head on the top of the fence. She heard the familiar bird song again, 2 notes, which she'd identified as the first 2 notes of Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, and felt herself begin to cry. Then she heard the neighbor's screen door open and bang close. Emma lifted her head and looked eastward to see Sid Sokolovsky in the middle of his back lawn, surveying his property with a critical eye. At last, she thought, swiping tears from her eyes. At last. Emma moved quickly to the fence that separated the Aubrays' property from the Sokolovskys'. She took hold of the top of it, and with an effort produced a smile. "Hi," she called out. Sid turned. His face brightened. "I heard the good news last night," he said, heading toward her. "Yes, isn't it wonderful?" said Emma enthusiastically. "Of course, it doesn't mean the end of my troubles," she said, casting a sigh. She looked up at Sid bravely. "But it's the beginning of the end of them. I'm very grateful to Mr. Alberg." "Karl's a good man," said Sid, "a good police officer, too. I was pretty sure he could help you." "Did he tell you how Charlie reacted?" said Emma. She laughed. "I was so excited I didn't think to ask him." Sid leaned on the fence. "He was pretty calm, I guess. You heard from him yet?" "Not yet," said Emma with an effort. Maybe he needs more time." "Yeah," said Sid. "Well, I don't hold with that myself." Emma was staring at the fence, trying to calm herself. It had rained earlier in the day, and the cedar was still wet, a deep, glowing red. "I don't know what's going to happen," she said. Sid shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "You're the one needs the time," he said. "I do. I probably do," said Emma. "I hope to hell the guy doesn't take it into his head to just show up here." She looked at him quickly. "Well," she said cautiously, "it would take him a while, though, wouldn't it, to get here?" "No, it's not that far. About an hour and a half by car, I guess," said Sid Sokolovsky. "Of course, he's got that float plane. He could just drop it in over at Porpoise Bay. That'd be real quick." Emma pored over the highway map of the Sunshine Coast. An hour and a half south. You couldn't drive south for an hour and a half without ending up in the ocean. An hour and a half north, then, and near water, because of the float plane. Late that afternoon, Emma sat in her car on the gravel shoulder of Highway 1, looking down the hill at the Ruby Lake Motel and Restaurant, about half a mile away. It was a somewhat ramshackle place, a one-story building that had spread in apparent aimlessness from its original structure, and now encompassed 4 or 5 small motel units, as well as the cafe. The lake itself was on the other side of the highway, a narrow piece of water bearing several small, thickly treed islands upon its blue-green surface. It looked small and crowded, but Emma knew from the map that although narrow, Ruby Lake was also long. Every so often she raised to her eyes a pair of opera glasses given to her by her mother for her 18th birthday, and studied the large smudged window in the front of the restaurant. She wasn't able to see much more than an occasional vague shadow. This had to be the place. It was the right distance from Seashelt, and she could see a float plane moored next to the lakeshore. The opera glasses were very old. Her mother had found them, she had told Emma, in an antiques shop. The leather case was worn, and so were the glasses themselves, but they worked well, and Emma liked the feel of them against her eyes. She put them on her lap and looked distractedly around her car's interior. She was surprised to notice on the seat next to her an empty glass bottle that had once held a fruit juice and mineral water combination. On the floor, a couple of scrunched-up gum wrappers, and what looked to be a used Kleenex. On the dashboard, a coating of dust. She looked over her shoulder into the back seat and saw a white sweater and several library books. These things were evidence of preoccupation. Emma kept her car in normal times as clean and tidy as she and Bernie kept the house. But never mind, she told herself, raising the glasses to her eyes. The end of the thing is in sight. The glasses were aimed at the door, and as she looked, it opened, and a couple of tourists came through and made for the parking lot. The screen door slapped closed behind them. And then it opened again, and a man wearing jeans emerged, striding toward the motel rooms. Charlie. Emma kept the glasses trained upon the back of his head and realized that she was half-crouched over the steering wheel as if attempting to hide herself. But if he did stop and turn and look up the hill, he'd recognize the car anyway, wouldn't he? It seemed that she didn't care. She watched him intently through the opera glasses and felt this to be her due, that she was able to watch him, unseen. Her mouth was dry, and her hands, clasping the glasses, were wet with sudden perspiration. She saw him reach with his right hand under his plaid shirt to scratch the top of his shoulder. She saw that he was wearing hiking boots. She watched him go through a door, leaving it open, and emerge carrying a mop and a pail full of what Emma assumed were cleaning supplies. She lowered the glasses for a moment, blinking in disbelief, and raised them again to see him pull a ring of keys from his pocket. He unlocked a door with the number 1 upon it, and disappeared inside with his mop and pail. Emma sank back in her seat. Did he have any idea how ludicrous he looked? Wearing jeans and a loudly colored shirt and carrying that mop, for heaven's sake, and a pail full of Windex and Mr. Clean and Sandy Flush toilet bowl cleaner or whatever he had in there. Her eyes had filled with tears, and there was a great ache in her chest, as if something had her in a vice. Emma bent her head and put the opera glasses back in their case. Whatever had possessed her mother to give her such a thing? She thought there were probably people in the world, somewhere in the world, in the farthest reaches of some place, who believed that the opera glasses, when presented to her, already contained all the images she would see through them. She brushed tears away, blew her nose, and sat upright again, her hands on the steering wheel. Who the hell knew why he'd done it? Who the hell cared? She turned on the motor and waited for a Winnebago with Ontario license plates to lumber past. Then she made a U-turn and headed south, back towards Seashelt. It occurred to her that there was no longer any reason for her to be living on the Sunshine Coast. She tried thinking of jobs she might like to do, of areas in Vancouver where she might like to live. She even wondered if she might not decide to live for a while in another part of the country. Calgary, maybe, or Winnipeg, or Halifax. And she named these cities, speaking out loud in the car, trying them out. But it was no use. It was too soon, because it wasn't over yet, the thing with Charlie. "I understand why you don't believe me," she had said to him on the night of their 5th wedding anniversary, "but it's true. A person can do almost anything, if she's resolute and reasonably intelligent, and I'm both. Plus, I'm organized." "And crazy," said Charlie, who she could tell was having a hard time controlling his temper. "Not at all crazy. Determined not to let you make a fool of yourself, that's all." "You can't change my mind, Emma. I don't know why you want to hang on like this. Christ, where's your pride? Where's your dignity? Why are you telling me such stupid lies?" "Her living room is small," said Emma. "There's a window that overlooks the street. The floor is oak, with a rug in the middle. There's a long sofa, 2 armchairs, a coffee table, 2 end tables." "Jesus Christ, Emma, who do you think you're kidding? You've just described half the living rooms in Vancouver. And there's a rather amazing collection of objects. They're from Mexico," she told me. "She was there for a couple of weeks last winter." Charlie's expression had changed. "The most amazing of them all," said Emma, "is a classroom of little devils. 20 little desks occupied by 20 little devils, with a great big devil up at the front, teaching them. Helena said it's made of plaster of Paris. Helena has very strange tastes, hasn't she?" She cocked her head at Charlie. "Now, truly, is that something I could have made up?" "Why the hell did you do it?" said Charlie hoarsely. "She's completely unsuitable for you, Charlie. I know your mother would agree." He looked at her for a long moment. "Emma, I don't know what to say to you. It's over, and I'm moving on." "I'm warning you, Charlie." "It won't work anymore, Emma." He stood up, and Emma knew this was because he wanted to tower over her. She looked straight ahead, into the leaves of the chiflera on the other side of the living room. She wasn't going to crane her neck and peer up at him. Emma's submissive days were over. Submissiveness didn't work. None of it worked. Not flirtatiousness, not submissiveness, not seduction, not hanging on his every word, not making sure his suits were pressed and his shoes were cleaned, not stocking cupboards and freezer and refrigerator with the things that were good for him and things he liked as well, not cleaning the damn toilet and sponging out the damn sink and doing the damn vacuuming, not taking damn courses and reading things she didn't care about just so she'd be interesting to Charlie. None of it worked. None of it. None of it. "So don't threaten me," he said, "because if you try to kill yourself again, I'll let you do it. So help me God, this time I'll let you die." "I'll do it there," she said, jam-packed with grief and rage. "I won't listen to this," said Charlie, and he turned to head for the door. "I'll do it right there," Emma shouted, "in Helena's living room, on Helena's couch, in front of Helena's devils." Charlie spun around and moved swiftly toward her. "I'll splash my red blood," said Emma, "all over Helena's steel-gray sofa." Charlie almost hit her. She could see it in his eyes. "I will," said Emma quietly. "I will." Chapter 43. "Move, move, 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 move." "Settle down, Gardner. Get us the fuck off of here." He was practically bug-eyed, and Eddie was pretty sure he was sweating. "You got two eyes in your head, Gardner. You can see there's no way I can move until the guy ahead of me moves, and no way he can move until... For God's sake, Gardner, we're in a line-up here. Have a smoke, relax, shut your eyes." He was surprised Gardner was that scared, even though he knew Gardner didn't like fairies. Well, it wasn't fairies, actually, or even boats that he didn't like. It was water, deep water, like you find in oceans or lakes or rivers. He didn't even like going over it on a bridge, and some bridges were worse than others. He'd go miles to avoid the new one south of Vancouver, the Alex Fraser Bridge. "It's so fucking high," he told Eddie. "You might as well be up in the fucking clouds." Finally they were docked, and the ferry guys started directing the lines of cars and trucks off the boat, and then they were on the road to Seashelt. "Okay, so pull over," said Gardner. Reluctantly, Eddie pulled over, and they switched places. "I'd like to know what you think we're going to do when we get there," said Eddie, feeling irritated. He wanted to be in his Camaro, not in Gardner's beat-up Olds Delta 88. And if he did have to sit in Gardner's beat-up Olds, he'd at least like to be able to drive it. But Gardner would only let him drive onto the ferry and off it. Eddie, looking out the window at the green trees, didn't really blame him. It was hard for anybody who knew how to drive to be a passenger. "We find the bitches," said Gardner, "where they live, and we break in and get your fucking letters." He'd been driving, with only the fingertips of his right hand on the steering wheel, his left elbow on the open window. But suddenly, as he steered around a corner, the road went practically straight up, and then around in a hairpin curve. "Holy shit," said Gardner, concentrating on his driving for a while. Once they were on the straight and narrow again, and it was certainly narrow, all right, thought Eddie. This road was nothing that deserved the word highway attached to it. Gardner said, "How big is this fucking town we're going to, anyway?" Eddie shook his head. "I don't know, not big, I think." About half an hour later they got there, and Eddie had been right. It wasn't big. "Jesus," said Gardner, cackling, striking the flat of his hand against the steering wheel. I never seen a place this small before." Eddie looked at him in disgust. It was nothing to brag about, never having been out of Vancouver in your entire life. Not in Eddie's opinion, anyway. "There sure aren't going to be a hell of a lot of people doing plays in this burg," said Gardner. "So what do? Cruise around looking in windows until we find them?" said Eddie. "We stop and look in a phone book," said Gardner. "Theaters have phones like everything else." But they didn't even have to do that. They parked on the main street, in front of a fish and chip shop, done up to look English, and went into the drugstore on the corner to buy Gardner some smokes. The ferry fare had just about wiped out Eddie's projects envelope, and he wouldn't get to put any more money in there until the end of the month, almost 3 whole weeks away. So he watched enviously while Gardner stuck the package of Craven A in his shirt pocket. And then he turned away so Gardner wouldn't see him eyeing the smokes. And there, right in front of his eyes, was a pink poster that said, "Sunshine Coast Theater Company presents 40. And then there was a bunch of information, dates and times and names of plays and on and on. Eddie poked Gardner with his elbow, and they both studied the poster intently. "Okay," said Gardner, decisively. "Got it." Back in the car, he revved the motor until Eddie winced. "Hey, let's not call attention to ourselves, okay?" Gardner was cackling his head off. "A tent! A tent! For fuck's sake, a tent!" They sat around a big table on the platform that would be their stage, doing the first read-through of the play that was to open in 2 weeks' time. People loved Agatha Christie. Kathy didn't pretend to understand why. She glanced around frequently as the cast worked its collective way through Act 1. Her character didn't make her appearance until shortly before the first curtain. They were in a huge red and white striped tent that had been set up in a meadow 3 miles north of town. Through the open flaps at the other end, Kathy could see the ocean across the highway, beyond a grove of trees. "Ainswick!" cried Caroline, as Midge. "Lovely, lovely Ainswick!" She had the best part of any of them, at least in this play, The Hollow. They'd be doing 2 more, but the casting for these hadn't been finalized. Kathy rested her chin on her hand, fingering the pages of her script, daydreaming. The side flaps were open, too, and every so often kids peered in at them. She heard, "My dad says I ought to call myself a domestic help," and realized they'd gotten to Sandy's first scene. Sandy was playing Doris, the maid, who was supposed to be a little bit half-witted and terrified of the butler. Kathy thumbed ahead in the script, looking for her entrance. A dog appeared in the opening at the far end of the tent. He observed them for a moment, tail wagging hesitantly, and then padded in their direction. "Muffy!" A boy of about 8 stuck his head around the corner. Kathy caught Sandy's eye. "Muffy?" she mouthed, silently. "Muffy!" The boy emitted a piercing whistle, and the cast, as one, lifted their faces from their scripts in time to see the dog run toward the boy and vanish with him around the corner. Oh, God, and here was Gerda, thought Kathy, wincing, straightening in her chair. "Oh, John, you don't mean that," said Gerda, and Kathy didn't dare look at Sandy or Caroline, because Gerda was the part Melanie was to have played. She tried not to listen, but that was neither fair nor wise, because, after all, they were going to be working with this woman the whole damn summer. They'd made their decision. Here they were, she hissed at herself furiously, causing the guy playing John, who was sitting next to her, to glance at her uneasily. Every so often someone darted across one of the gaps created by the swung-back tent flaps, or sat down on the grass to listen for a while. Kathy heard somebody trip, swearing, over one of the guy wires. She glanced over to see a big fellow with reddish hair start picking himself up from the ground. "Veronica," said the director. Those wires were damn dangerous, she thought indignantly, watching him limp quickly out of sight. "Veronica," said the director, more sharply. Kathy's heart lurched. "Oh, God, sorry," she said, scanning the page. "You must forgive me," she said, "for bursting in upon you this way." "Christ, Eddie, you stupid weasel!" Gardner had grabbed him by the sleeve of his denim shirt and was literally dragging him across the grass to where the car was parked by the side of the highway. But he was laughing as he said it. "Ass over tea kettle! Shit, you got the brains of a fat-ass toad!" They climbed into the car, and Eddie waited to catch his breath before shutting his door. But Gardner didn't wait. He started the motor and got the broken-down Oldsmobile heading down the road, and Eddie, grabbing at the door handle, almost fell on his face right out of the car, which just made Gardner laugh harder. They found a place where they could get a hamburger and a beer, and they took the food back to the car and drove back to nearby the tent so they could watch people coming and going. "Did you hear any of that crap?" said Gardner, munching. "Some of it. I never heard such boring shit in my life." They finished eating, and they drank their beers, and they waited and waited. After a while, Eddie got out of the car and sat on the grass. Gardner wandered across the highway and disappeared among the trees. "Fuck this," he muttered when he got back. "The fucking ocean's over there." They'd been waiting for more than 2 hours when people started dribbling out of the tent, heading for cars parked on a road that went off the highway along the side of the meadow. They climbed quickly back into Gardner's car and waited another few minutes. Eddie, just to be safe, slid down in the passenger seat so he couldn't be seen. He stayed there on the floor, his head bumping against the bottom of the glove compartment, his legs cramping, while Gardner watched for the girls. Eddie had told him what they looked like. "Okie dokie," said Gardner, firing up the Olds. "Here we go." He could be a good driver when he wanted to, Gardner. He moved them along smooth as silk, whistling softly to himself. "We're leaving the highway here, going up this here road. It's looking good, my man. Not much civilization up this way. Okay, they're turning off. I'm following. They're pulling into a driveway here, and I'm keeping right on going. Looking over at me, they are. I'm giving them a friendly little wave." "Jesus, don't," said Eddie, horrified. "Hi, bitches, hi there," said Gardner, waving. "Going, going, going." "Okay, can't see them anymore." Eddie hauled himself off the floor and onto the seat. He was panting a little bit, as if he'd been working out. "Okay, I'm going to cruise by one more time, sport," said Gardner, getting the car turned around, "to get the lay of the land." They were on a very narrow road, with no yellow line down the middle of it. On one side was a thick forest. On the other were some dug-up places where new houses were going to be built. Every so often there was an old house set in the middle of a huge lot that Eddie figured was probably actually a small farm. Most of them had other buildings on them besides the house, barns and hen houses and things. They drove slowly past some more land cleared for building and approached a small white house with big flowering bushes at the front door. "That's her," said Gardner, pointing. "That's the place." He stopped the car, motor running. "Shit, Gardner, don't let them see you," said Eddie, ducking. Gardner had a big smile on his face. "No problem," he said. "Duck soup." He turned to Eddie and gave him a playful punch in the shoulder. "Your troubles are nearly over, Ed." He revved the motor and sped away, laying rubber. "Christ, Gardner," said Eddie, craning to watch the small white house as it rapidly got smaller and then disappeared. "Now we get ourselves some more food," said Gardner, "and a six-pack, and we tilt ourselves a couple till it gets dark." They sped down the hill, back onto the highway, and through town, heading south. They picked up hamburgers and French fries at a takeout place and found the liquor store, where Gardner sprang for a case of beer. They discovered a logging road and drove along it a couple of miles inland. Gardner didn't want to be too close to the ocean. Gardner turned on the radio and seemed surprised to find the same station coming through that he listened to in Vancouver. He sang along in his twangy voice, and Eddie, so as not to get irritated with the country music, and not to get nervous at the thought of breaking into somebody's house, which he'd never done before, and which he could just hear Sylvia yelling at him about, drank one beer after another. So did Gardner. When it got dark, Eddie said, "Should we go do it now?" Gardner shook his head. "Kinda wait till they're asleep." "How long?" "I don't know. What do you think?" "I don't know when bitches go to sleep." "When it's midnight, we'll drive past the place, see if there are any lights on." When midnight came, they did, and saw no lights. But they drove past and waited a while longer, just to be sure. It was getting cold, and they'd run out of beer. And then they went back to the small white house. Gardner switched off the lights before they got there, and turned off the motor, too, and the car drifted to a stop a little way past the house, on the other side of the road. For a few minutes, nothing happened. Then both doors opened, and Eddie and Gardner got out. Chapter 44. There was a moon that night, and the wind tossed trees around, creating shadows to roam in Kathy's bedroom. She lay sleepless in her single bed, watching the shadows flicker across the wall. The room was so depressing, filled with boxes she'd been too tired to unpack before falling into bed. There were altogether too many things to worry about. That was the problem, she thought, turning over, tossing her pillow on the floor. First, she was pretty sure she'd been badly cast in the Hollow. Second, she didn't like Seashelt. It looked like a very boring place. Third, she missed Melanie. And fourth, she wondered if she shouldn't have stayed in Vancouver after all, and looked for non-theater work that would have paid some real money. Kathy heard one of her roommates moving around somewhere in the house, sleepless like herself, moving quietly so as not to disturb anyone. It must be Sandy. It wouldn't occur to Caroline that anything she did could possibly bother anybody. "Oh, don't be a bitch," Kathy told herself impatiently, and turned over again. There was a thin strip of light around the blind, covering the open window. Every so often it widened, as the blind shivered and moved into the room on a puff of wind, and narrowed again when the wind subsided. There was a faint clattering sound as the slat at the bottom of the blind struck the windowsill. Maybe if she went through her problems one at a time, looking at each one clearly, they'd turn out not to be so bad after all. She knew that worries attracted other worries like magnets, glomming together to create something intolerably heavy, and that when she was able to grab them and deal with them one at a time, life was a lot more manageable. Kathy retrieved her pillow, propped it against the headboard, and leaned back, her arms crossed under her breasts. First, the casting. She was playing Veronica Cray, an actress who was incredibly beautiful and knew it. Kathy winced whenever she thought about it. There was no way she could believably play incredibly beautiful. "Trust me," the director had said. But this was always a problem for Kathy. She hated relinquishing control, though she knew this was an essential part of learning a role. She'd just have to grit her teeth and do it, she thought. Let herself go. Make herself try everything Doreen suggested. If it didn't work, if it turned out that she really had been miscast, this would be quickly obvious to everybody. The wind caused the blind to flutter again, and Kathy felt a gust of nighttime caress her face, bringing with it the scent of the lilacs that grew at the front of the house. She'd been very glad to see the lilacs. They reminded her of her parents' house in Richmond. Next, Seashelt. She admitted that it was pretty, but there was absolutely nothing to do here. She punched at her pillow, which was thin and knobbly, and arranged it behind her head. Of course, she'd only just arrived, just barely met the rest of the company. As soon as they began to know one another, they'd start exploring the town together, and eventually they'd settle on a place, a cafe or a bar, that would become their place for the remainder of the summer. Kathy's common sense told her this, and she knew it was true. Down the hall the toilet flushed, and she heard the hall floor squeak, and the sound of Sandy's door softly closing. Kathy knew Sandy was lonely in there, although she hadn't said so. It was the biggest of the bedrooms, with twin beds and 2 chests of drawers and a huge closet. Sandy and Melanie had been going to share it. She groped for the travel alarm clock on her bedside table. 1:30. Shit. She still wasn't a bit sleepy, and she had to get up in 5 hours. She lay on her back, hands behind her head. Her mother always said that if you couldn't sleep, you might as well get up and do something. Read or watch TV or bake bread or something. Go for a walk, maybe. A swath of bright light swept suddenly, unexpectedly, through her room, which was a corner room at the back of the house. Kathy felt for a moment as if she were on a ship that had come too close to a lighthouse. She experienced a strong sense of motion because of the shifting shadows on her bedroom walls and the beam of light flashing its warning. But almost immediately she heard the sound of automobile tires and realized that what she'd seen was the headlights of a passing car. At least she had transportation. Thank God she had transportation. If she got totally fed up with being in this rinky-dink town, sharing a house all summer with the same people she lived with the rest of the year, depressed at not doing well enough in the show, she'd hop in her car and get the hell out of here for the day. Go back to Vancouver, see her family, get free food, and some TLC from her parents. It was too depressing to consider her fourth worry, which was money. There wasn't a damn thing she could do except plummet deeper and deeper into debt. Maybe when she graduated she'd work for a year at something other than the theater, something that paid well, so she could knock off at least part of her loan real fast. Or maybe, she thought, smiling to herself, she'd be lucky. Maybe she'd get some television work or a film and make a lot of bucks quickly. Who knows, she thought. Anything's possible. At this point, Kathy heard something. But it was a sound not immediately identifiable, a foreign sound, unconnected to anything she was thinking about, and so she ignored it. Her brain, preoccupied with worrying, absently stashed it away somewhere. Kathy could consider the nature and significance of this sound later, if necessary, assuming, of course, that she could remember later just where in her brain she'd put it. She looked again at her clock and, to her dismay, saw that only 7 minutes had passed. She was going to have to get up and do something all right. Baking bread seemed a bit much, and she didn't want to go for a walk because that would mean getting dressed. And probably by the time she'd gotten dressed, she'd be tired, and then she'd just have to get undressed again. But that's what she wanted, right? To feel tired? Tired enough to sleep? She wondered what was on TV. Some old series, probably. Maybe an old movie or two. Now she was hungry. Christ, she said to herself, this was getting ridiculous. Down the hall she heard the floor squeak again, and Sandy's door opening. Fuck this, thought Kathy, and she flung back her covers. She'd drag Sandy into the kitchen, and they'd make themselves a snack and then go watch TV. And so what if she didn't get any sleep the whole fucking night? She was halfway to the door when the world exploded. The next minutes passed like a dream in which flight is imperative, but fleeing is impossible. Kathy moved as if swimming through a sea of molasses. She turned, aimed herself at the open bedroom window, and propelled herself through it to the hard-packed ground below. It felt to her as though she'd bounced, lightly, like a feather, but later she saw that she'd skinned both her knees. Kathy, the feather, strained across the grass toward the forest, weightless, insubstantial, blown by small desultory puffs of a careless breeze, moving with agonizing slowness. But when she touched the trunk of the first tree, the world snapped back into its proper rhythm, and Kathy, released, ran. She pelted through the forest, barefoot, sobbing, her hands flung out in front of her to catch branches before they whipped at her face. She stumbled, fell, scrambled to her feet, ran, fell again, staggered up again, ran again. And she heard him behind her, and maybe she imagined this, but it made her run harder and faster, and finally she erupted from the woods onto the highway. It was sleek and black, and the yellow line down the center was garish in the moonlight. The wind tossed restlessly in the trees and sent bits of woodland skittering across the road. There wasn't a car in sight, nor a building either. Kathy stood on the highway, panting, looking from left to right, trying not to listen to the sounds in the forest behind her. And when a car did finally appear from the left, she flattened herself in the ditch and gripped the weeds that grew there. She felt the soft flesh of dandelions dying in her hands. As the car drew closer, she forced herself to peer over the shoulder of the road. It was an RCMP patrol car. Kathy struggled to her feet and began screaming. Chapter 45. The white cat had one hazel eye and one blue one. He sat in the sun on the narrow stone walk that led to the small white house and cleaned himself. His tongue had backward curving spines like the teeth of a comb. The sun warmed him while he licked, industriously, thoroughly. When it was time to do his face and ears, he licked the inner surfaces of his forepaws and used them as a washcloth. The cat had been outside for several hours now. He had been frightened from his customary sleeping place on the living-room sofa and had fled outdoors to find shelter in a woodshed at the bottom of the yard. He'd emerged just when the sky was beginning to lighten, when a silver sheen hung over the world and the dew was thick on the grass. The cat had crept back to the house when he saw signs of activity there. From within the screen of lilac bushes by the front door, he had observed several people coming and going. None was familiar, so he had backed away to groom himself in the sun. Now he sidled along the walk and peered through the doorway. After a moment's hesitation, he edged around the open door into the house. There were two men at the end of the hall with their backs to the front door. One was standing, the other was kneeling. They were looking down at the floor. The cat padded near and tried to see around the kneeling man, but couldn't. He slid into the nearest of the bedrooms, where one of the blinds was still down, outlined thinly in sunlight. But the other blind had been raised, and the sun had burst through, falling upon another man who was crouched beside the bed. The cat crept to the other side of the bed, away from the man. He saw the limp arm that dangled over the edge of the mattress, and swatted it with his paw. This attracted the attention of the man, who said, "Get out of here," and made a swift, threatening gesture. The cat loped away to seek refuge in the living room, where he leapt silently onto the sofa, then the sofa back, and then the open shelving that held books and knickknacks and plants and pots. He stood on his hind legs and reached up, stretching, to sharpen his claws on the heavy cedar from which the bookcase was constructed. Then he sat, front paws close together, and he curled his tail around his body and yawned. Unblinking, he watched the doorway. None of the voices he heard was yet familiar. A few minutes later he descended from the bookcase and ambled out of the living room, across the hall, and into the kitchen. He lapped some water from one of his dishes and sniffed at the other, which was empty. He went to the doorway and peeked around in time to see the kneeling man stand up. The cat edged out of the kitchen and slithered along the wall until he got to the inert shape on the floor. Delicately, he sniffed the outflung arm and the large wet spot on the wooden floor. "Beat it," said one of the men. The cat ran into one of the other bedrooms and sprang onto the empty, rumpled bed, and then onto the window-sill. He sat there in the wide open window, holding his face into the warm, fragrance-laden breeze. Then he leapt down and returned to the kitchen, to sniff again at his food dish. "You hungry, cat?" said Alberg as he entered the room. The cat uttered a creaky meow. Alberg opened cupboards, hooking his ballpoint pen behind the chrome pools, until he found a box of dry food. He poured some into the cat's dish. Sanducci came into the kitchen. "The hospital says you can talk to her now, staff." "You okay?" said Alberg. Sanducci's olive skin had an alarming layer of white beneath it. "Yeah, I'm okay," he hesitated. "Her name's Kathy." "Kathy," Alberg repeated. He looked closely at the corporal. "You better come with me, Sanducci." They went into the hall. "Alex, are you finished?" The doctor leaned, dizzy, against the wall. "Yeah, Jesus." Alberg went out onto the porch and gestured to the ambulance attendants waiting by their vehicle. When they reached him, he said, "There's one at the end of the hall and one in the first bedroom." He stood on the porch looking toward the small crowd of people that had gathered on the street in front of the house. It was a relief to get out into the fresh air. He had turned his eyes into a camera, but there was nothing he could do about his other senses, and he was sick from the smell of blood. "You want to go now, staff?" said Sanducci. Alberg glanced back down the hall and quickly away into the living room. He saw blossoms filling a vase that had been set upon a wooden table, branches of deep pink flowers whose petals had begun to fall, scattering themselves over the tabletop and upon the floor. "Yeah," said Alberg. He put a hand on Sanducci's shoulder. "Let's go talk to Kathy." Chapter 46. All Eddie could think of was that they were going to get up, the two of them, what was left of them, all red and dripping, and come after him and Gardner. He wasn't afraid of the cops or the girl that got away. He was only afraid of the dead girls. He could see them getting onto their dead feet, wobbly and shaken, with blood on their faces, blood on their chests, big chunks of flesh gone, accusation in their eyes. Already he could see this. He'd barely turned away from the open window the girl had gone through when he saw it. Staring down at the one lying dead in the hallway, he'd seen it even in her stillness, her blood-spattered inertness. Even as he saw that she would never move again, he saw her begin to move, to stand, to raise a hand, to point. He leapt over her and ran down the hall after Gardner, who was already halfway to the car. Gardner scuttled across the lawn, across the road, and it looked to Eddie like Gardner's legs had suddenly become too long for him to manipulate. He was covering ground fast, though, clutching at it, pulling it toward him, like a spider skittering, or a person swimming. Eddie was moving fast, too. He got to the car just as Gardner cranked up the motor. He flung himself inside and slammed the door shut. "Oh, God, oh, Jesus," Gardner kept saying, over and over again. "Oh, God, oh, Jesus." Eddie didn't say anything. He just looked out the window into the darkness and waited for his heart to stop pounding, waited for his chest to stop hurting, waited for what had happened not to be true. He stared intently at the world Gardner was rushing them through, seeing it awash in light from the moon. The few houses they sped past were dark. There were no cars on the road, and even when they reached the town, he saw street lights, but no sign of life. It was as if they were all dead, everybody in Seashelt, as if every single person had died when those two girls died. Except, of course, the girl that got away. But maybe she was dead by now, too, Eddie thought, lying dead in the forest, scared to death. Gardner took the winding, hilly road to the ferry terminal so fast Eddie felt like he was on a roller coaster. When they got there, a sign told them the first ferry didn't leave until 6 o'clock. Gardner turned to Eddie. "What do we do?" "Go back in the bush, I guess." Eddie thought about Sylvia for a minute. He wanted to call her up so he could hear her talking to him. It wouldn't matter what she said, or even if she was mad at him for calling her so early. It would be very good to hear her voice. Gardner turned around and drove back to town, and through it, and along the highway for a while, and off onto the logging road. And he parked in the same place they'd spent the evening, waiting for it to be night. "What are we going to do, Eddie?" he said, when he turned off the motor. Eddie shrugged, feeling immensely weary. "Do you think she saw us?" "I don't know." "We got to get out of here. Isn't there another way? Isn't there a goddamn road somewhere?" "There's another ferry. Up at the other end, it goes over to Vancouver Island." "And then what, for fuck's sake? We'd have to take another ferry, right? Back to Vancouver? So one way we take one ferry and the other way we take two ferries. Is that right?" "Right." Gardner sank back in his seat. Fuck, what a fucking mess. Maybe if they stayed here long enough, Eddie thought, looking at the squashed beer cans and the empty potato chip bags cluttering up the moonlight, time would go back to when it hadn't happened yet. The bends in the beer cans would go away, and they'd fill up with beer again, and the potato chip bags would get smoothed out and fill up with potato chips, and it would be last night again, and he and Gardner could change their minds and take the last ferry home. "We got to disguise ourselves," Gardner had said only a few hours ago, although it seemed like years. "What?" said Eddie, dismayed. "How?" "Bags over our heads." Gardner, tossing a can out the window, started cackling. "Or socks. Or those nylon stocking things. Pantyhose." "I'm not wearing a bag on my head," said Eddie sullenly. "And what you're talking about? Socks. You couldn't get a sock to go over your head. And I'm not wearing any damn nylon stocking on my face either." Gardner was hooting with laughter now, clutching at his stomach, banging his forehead against the steering wheel. "We don't need disguises," Eddie insisted loudly. "We're going in there in the middle of the night. They're going to be asleep." "No, but we gotta," said Gardner, sobering up. "You never know. One of them might wake up. Maybe a car drives by and backfires or something, and somebody wakes up. It happens, Ed, believe me." He was shaking his head and looking like he knew stuff that Eddie didn't. He started the car and drove them back down to Seashelt. "Okay," he said to Eddie, parking outside a drugstore. "Go in there and get us some pantyhose." "Fuck you," said Eddie promptly. Gardner leaned back and sighed. "Look, Weasel, why am I here, eh? Out of friendship. I'm doing you a big favor here, helping you get yourself out of a big horse trough of shit." Eddie sat there for a long time. Then he got out of the car and went into the drugstore. He came out 15 minutes later, carrying a plastic shopping bag. "What the fuck you got in there?" "Never mind, just drive." "What's in there?" Gardner said again, pulling out into the traffic. "Stuff." "What stuff? Did you get them or not?" I got them. When they were parked off the logging road in the bush again, Gardner snatched the bag from Eddie's lap and dumped the contents onto the seat between them. 2 pairs of black pantyhose, queen size. "Queen size? Queen size?" Gardner sniggered. He pawed through the rest of the stuff. A rodent track magazine, 2 packages of sugarless gum, an alarm clock in a cardboard box, a bottle of aspirin, and a box of Kleenex. "Where'd you get all this other crap?" "I couldn't go in there and just get the pantyhose," Eddie snapped. "It looks suspicious." Gardner tore open one of the packages, shook the hose free from a piece of cardboard, took hold of the waistband, and pulled it over his head. "What do you think?" he said to Eddie. Eddie put up his hand to hide his face. "What do I do with these?" said Gardner, fingering the legs, which hung down on either side of his head like 2 enormous rabbit ears. "You're the expert," said Eddie, smiling behind his hand. "Tie them on top of your head," he suggested, "like they were shoelaces." So Gardner did. Eddie laughed out loud. Gardner yanked the rearview mirror around so he could get a look at himself. "Fuck," he said, staring. "I'll cut them off." Eddie unwrapped the second package. Cautiously, he pulled the pantyhose over his head. Gardner, who had removed his mask, looked closely at Eddie. "Jesus, Ed, it really works." He pushed the mirror toward him. Eddie studied himself. Behind the fabric, which was not really black, but dark gray, he was unrecognizable, even to himself. His nose was pushed slightly to one side. There were blackish spots where his eyes were, and as he breathed, he made a small wet spot. His ears were pushed flat against his head. He had no hair. His whole head looked like a non-human thing, made of something like rubber. "Yeah," he said to Gardner, "it really works. It really does." And now they were back here again, and the intervening hours had changed their lives forever. The beer cans lay where they'd thrown them, and the potato chip bags, too, maybe blown around a little by the wind, but basically right where they'd tossed them. The magazine was on the car floor, and the aspirin bottle was down there, too, and also the alarm clock in its box. The gum was in Eddie's pocket. The Kleenex was next to him on the seat. Eddie stared at these things. He could give the alarm clock to Harry, he thought. "What happened, Eddie? What the fuck happened, anyway?" Gardner asked him in a whisper. Gardner's eyes were huge. Eddie just shook his head again. "I don't know," he said, and he was surprised that there wasn't any expression in his voice. It felt like something had cracked to death in his chest, and he would have thought this would be obvious in his voice, but it wasn't. In the car, parked across the road from the house, they'd pulled the pantyhose over their heads and made sure the interior light wouldn't come on when they opened the doors. "Okay, man, let's go for it," said Gardner, and they got out of the car. "Wait a minute," he'd said, pushing the driver's door softly closed. He went around to the back, unlocked the trunk, and hauled out the shotgun. "What's that for?" said Eddie, alarmed. "Just in case they wake up. We'd need it, you know," he pointed the shotgun at Eddie, "to keep them under control, till we get them tied up and gagged." He walked across the road and onto the lawn. "They're not gonna wake up," said Eddie in a furious whisper, following him. "How the fuck do we get in?" said Gardner, keeping his voice low. "Maybe they don't lock their doors." He jiggled the handle. "Shh," said Eddie. Gardner began tiptoeing along the front of the house. Eddie pulled nervously at the waistband of the pantyhose around his neck. He could see tufts of Gardner's hair sticking through the holes where the legs had been, and he fumbled at the top of his head to see if that was happening to his hair, too. "Look at this," Gardner whispered excitedly, and he pointed to a window that had been left open about 3 inches. Eddie pushed it up and climbed through, and took the shotgun from Gardner while he climbed in. They stood still for a moment, listening intently. Eddie blinked frequently behind his mask. It felt like he was keeping his eyes open under water. Once they were sure nobody had heard them, they looked cautiously around. They were in a small dining room. Straight ahead there was a kitchen. Off to the right, across a hallway, a lot of moonlight was pouring into what looked like a living room. The moon was so bright that it lit up the whole front part of the house, which was full of stuff, boxes and bags and piles of clothes. Eddie couldn't see any sign of boxes with Melanie on them. "Okay, let's get going," whispered Gardner. "What does this box look like?" Before Eddie could answer, he went on. "It's probably in the bedroom. We're probably going to have to go in the bedroom, wake them up. What do you say we locate some rope?" he said, still whispering, and he started opening cupboards and drawers. "Shh," Eddie hissed. And all of a sudden, it was like some kind of dream, being there. He couldn't believe he was standing there in some stranger's kitchen. "I've done breaking and entering," he kept thinking. "Breaking and entering, breaking and entering." It repeated itself over and over in his head. "No," he said to Gardner, and pulled off his mask. "This is crazy. No." He felt dazed and stupid and terrified, and when he heard noises down the hall, it wasn't a surprise to him. It felt to him like thunder does. First you see the lightning, And then comes the thunder. You might not like it much. It might scare the hell out of you, but you knew it was coming. It's no surprise. Eddie moved 2 steps to his right and looked down the hall and saw her come out of one of the rooms down there. She looked at him for a split second, and he saw that she had carroty-colored hair, like him. And then Eddie raised the shotgun and fired. She dropped to the floor amazingly fast, as if he'd shot her legs right out from under her, and behind where she'd been standing, the wall was sprayed red. Eddie started down the hall toward her. He didn't know what he planned to do when he got there, and heard a sound coming from behind a door on his left. He pushed it open and saw another girl, sitting up in bed, wearing something white, and he lifted the shotgun and fired again. Gardner was shrieking at him, clawing at his arm. Eddie's only thought was that there were 3 of them, 3 girls. He went down the hall to the 3rd bedroom and found an empty bed and an open window. The blind had been whacked upward so hard and so fast that it was still bouncing. Eddie and Gardner saw the 3rd girl pause at the edge of the woods, look back toward the house, and disappear into the trees. Gardner tore his mask off. "Eddie, Christ!" he was crying and shaking. "What the fuck? Why? Why?" Chapter 47. "I heard there was a witness," said Sokolovsky from the doorway. "Yeah. Come on in, Sid." The sergeant entered Alberg's office and sat down. "What do you figure, Karl?" Alberg picked up his notebook and flipped back the pages. 2 guys, amateurs. We know there were 2 of them because they left footprints, for Christ's sake. Under the window. They climbed in through an open window. An open window, he repeated, looking at Sokolovsky, who just shook his head. They came in through the window wearing nylon masks, which they left behind, by the way, and they blow 2 of the 3 girls away, and they leave. He tossed the notebook down on his desk. "We got roadblocks at both ferry terminals and the airport. The victims lived in Vancouver. They'd only just arrived here. If it was a premeditated thing, it's got to be somebody they knew over there." "Why didn't they do the witness, too?" "Because she happened to be awake and on her feet when the shooting started. She got away. Out the window. Christ. They come in a front window. She goes out a back window. What a farce. Except that in between, 2 girls get splattered all over the walls. Christ." "What's she got to say?" "She heard the first shot and ran. That's what she told Sanducci. He picked her up on the highway. I just got back from the hospital, but now she's in shock, and she's not saying anything at all." He went over to the window and raised the Venetian blind. "She told him something else, too. Originally, there were 4 of them, 4 roommates, sharing a house in Vancouver. A week and a half ago, one of them was the victim of a hit-and-run." He looked quizzically at Sid. Are you connecting that with this?" said Sokolovsky doubtfully. "I don't know yet. I've got a call into Vancouver." "When can you talk to the witness?" "They say maybe by noon." He leaned toward the sergeant. "If she can give us suspects, we've got the masks, footprints, maybe enough evidence already to nail the bastards." "But if they went in there to kill them and not to rob them, then why bother with the masks?" Alberg shrugged. "In case somebody saw them going in or coming out, maybe." "Okay, another alternative. Maybe we got us a couple of local Looney Tunes here." "It's possible," said Alberg, "but I don't think so. We know all the crazies on the coast. I can't think of one of them who'd pull something like this." "I gotta get something to eat," said Eddie, talking loudly over the sound of the wind rushing in through the open window. "Fuck that. Wait till we're on the ferry, then eat," said Gardner, maneuvering the Oles pell-mell along the road toward Seashelt. "I gotta eat now, or I'm going to pass out or something. I need something on my stomach right now. Stop at the next place. I mean it, Gardner. I'm going to be sick or die or something." If he'd been in Vancouver, he could have gone to Sylvia's house for a lettuce and tomato sandwich and a beer. But he wasn't in Vancouver, and it scared him not to be there, because it was making Sylvia's house get hazy in his mind. It was like he was running away from it, backward, watching it get smaller and smaller. Gardner was shrieking at him. "What are you, crazy? We gotta get out of here." "No, I gotta eat first," said Eddie doggedly. Gardner was sweating a lot. He kept wiping the sweat off his face with his shirt sleeve, but it just popped out again, and it must have been pouring into his armpits, too. The smell of it was making Eddie nauseous. "Shut the damn window," Gardner yelled, and Eddie was shivering with the cold by now. So he rolled up the window, which made the smell a whole lot worse. "I gotta eat," said Eddie, "right now." "Shit," said Gardner. But he swerved off the road to park in front of a cafe with a sign out front that said, "Earl's." From the car they peered in through the big front window. "This is crazy, man, crazy," said Gardner. Eddie opened the passenger door and got out. All of his bones ached. He'd always been convinced that when he got pain, it was more pain than most people would suffer from exactly the same ailment. Eddie was bigger than most people, and therefore so was his pain. They sidled into the cafe. That is, Gardner sidled in. Eddie just walked in as if everything was normal, thinking about nothing but the pain in his bones and his hunger. Gardner led the way to the table that was farthest from the door. He slithered into a chair and immediately opened the menu, crouching down behind it. Eddie didn't look at the menu. He already knew what he wanted. "Pancakes and sausages," he said to the Chinese man who took their order, "and a large glass of orange juice, and coffee." "Just coffee," said Gardner. "I want to look at this some more," he said, hanging on to the menu. Eddie took a few cautious looks around. There weren't many people in the place. A big guy with a beard sat at a table near the window. There was a young brown and white dog at his feet, which kind of surprised Eddie, who thought there was some kind of law against letting animals into restaurants. Unless they were seeing eye dogs, of course, which this one wasn't. And a tired-looking woman sat at another table, drinking coffee and smoking and reading a paperback book. And there was a young guy at the counter. He was wearing the kind of coveralls that mechanics wear, and eating what looked to be bacon and eggs. Gardner continued to hide behind the menu. The Chinese man set down the orange juice and 2 mugs of coffee. A little later he returned with Eddie's pancakes. "Put down the menu, Gardner," said Eddie, just as a young guy with longish hair came in. "Hi, Warren," said the young guy, sitting down next to the mechanic. "Yo, Bentley," said the mechanic. "I'll have a coffee, Earl," said Bentley. Eddie, eating his pancakes, listened to them at first idly and then intently. Gardner, once he clued into what they were saying, started giving Eddie urgent little kicks under the table, which Eddie ignored. "Who is this you're talking about?" said Warren, the mechanic. "Girls from Vancouver, over here for the summer. They were renting the Lester place up on Anchor Road," said Bentley, who, it turned out, was an ambulance driver. "And somebody killed them?" said the mechanic, sounding incredulous. "Why?" "How do I know why? They're dead, that's all I know. Shot to death, 2 of them. What a mess. You never saw anything like it." He drank almost his entire cup of coffee in one gulp. "The other one's in the hospital. Shock. Jesus, no wonder." "Who did it?" said the proprietor. "Jesus, Earl, I don't know who did it. The cops don't know who did it. How the hell would I know who did it?" "Give me an order of brown toast, too, will you?" "Eddie," hissed Gardner. Eddie forked pancakes and maple syrup into his mouth. "And you know," Bentley went on, "this is weird, but it turns out they used to live with Melanie Franklin. Now, is that weird or is that weird?" "Eddie, we gotta get going," said Gardner, who was sweating even more now and wiping it off his face with serviettes from the metal container on the table. "I could pretend I worked in the hospital," thought Eddie, trying to plan. "A janitor. Or I could pretend to be her brother or something." "Eddie," said Gardner more loudly, but nobody else heard him. Everybody in the cafe was listening, transfixed, to Bentley, the ambulance driver. "Her folks moved up to Lund, I think," said Earl, setting a plate of brown toast on the counter in front of the ambulance driver. "Last summer." Eddie pulled his wallet out of his back pocket. It was thin, because there was hardly anything in it, and curved, because he sat on it so much. He pulled out a 5. Earl spotted this and came over to the table with a coffee pot. "Just the bill," said Eddie. Gardner was wiping the palms of his hands on his knees. He was pale and continued to sweat, watching Earl write out their bill. Eddie knew from the movies that's what he ought to do, all right. Sneak into the hospital in disguise and what? Do what? He slapped the 5 down on top of the bill. "Come on," he said to Gardner, and plodded from the restaurant, Gardner skittering in his wake. Chapter 48. "We're trying to see if there's a connection," said Alberg gently, "between what happened to Melanie and what happened here last night." Nora Gibbons sat in a chair next to Kathy Schofield's bed, taking notes. But Sanducci, standing at the foot, was taking notes too. Constable Gibbons was mostly keeping an eye on Kathy. "Yes," said Kathy, "I see." Sanducci thought she'd shrunk since he'd first seen her in the gray Reliant, with her roommates and the skunk cabbages, and every bit of color had been bleached from her face. Her eyes were unnaturally round. Sometimes he could see an edging of white all the way round the pupil. Only her hair looked, as he remembered it, thick and dark, cut away behind one ear, falling softly across the opposite cheek. He chastised himself half-heartedly for having lustful thoughts about a person still suffering a severe case of shock. "Well, actually," said Kathy, "no, I don't see." She was in a hospital bed, wearing a hospital gown. When he had stopped the patrol car for her, she'd had on a pair of cotton jockey shorts made for women, and a sleeveless cotton undershirt. She was scratched, scraped, dirty, and hysterical. "I mean, if you're saying maybe Melanie that it wasn't really an accident, the police came, you know, and talked to us." She began nodding her head, her conviction growing. "It was definitely an accident, definitely. I think we have to consider the alternative, though, even if it's just to be thorough." Sanducci actually saw her heartbeat accelerate. He happened to be looking at her throat, at the small, pale hollow at the base of her elegant neck, and he saw the beating of her heart cause the skin there to shudder and vibrate. He looked quickly at Alberg, who was leaning forward, his hands clasped lightly between his knees. He looked completely relaxed, as if he had all the time in the world and absolutely nothing on his mind but Kathy. From the other side of the bed, Nora Gibbons said firmly, "It's all right, Kathy. You're perfectly safe. Your parents are on their way, and we'll be with you every minute until they get here." She reached to touch the back of Kathy's hand. Kathy squeezed her eyes tightly closed and grabbed Nora's hand in both of hers, holding it so tightly that Sanducci saw it whiten in Kathy's grip. Nora Gibbons and Alberg exchanged a glance. Alberg gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head. Kathy had begun to weep. Tears washed down her cheeks and flooded the tiny lines on either side of her mouth and splashed from the edge of her jaw. Alberg got a handful of tissues from a box on the table next to the bed and tucked it into the clasping of Kathy's hands with Nora's. Sanducci was acutely aware of himself. It was cruelly difficult to stand here doing nothing. He was at his best when he was physically active. He felt confident then, and purposeful. He hated standing still. He hated taking notes. He looked through the small window in the top of the door and saw a figure hurrying past along the corridor, a female figure wearing a white hat. And he could hear brief, muted messages being relayed over an intercom system. But it seemed to him that the world out there was ephemeral, that the only reality was here, that it was a false and treacherous reality that could be blown apart in an instant with a single shotgun blast, and that there ought to be something he could do to prevent this. Kathy let go of Nora's hand and rubbed at her face with the tissues. She blew her nose and opened her eyes, blinking furiously, gazing straight into Sanducci's face. He felt his heart soar into his throat. "Yeah, but it's a hard thing to wrap your mind around, that somebody—" She turned to look at Alberg. "I don't know how to do this. I don't know what you want me to do." "I want you to think hard and make a list of anybody you can think of who might have had a grudge against Melanie, or Sandy, or Caroline, or me." Alberg nodded. "Or you." She was already shaking her head. "There's nobody. I'm telling you, there isn't anybody." "We're looking for anything at all," said Alberg. "Somebody, one of you stood up, jilted, wronged in some way, or who could have thought he'd been wronged." "He," said Kathy. "Yeah, definitely a he." Alberg stood up. "Rack your brains, okay, Kathy? Constable Gibbons and Corporal Sanducci will help you." Chapter 49. Emma felt the need to seek advice, but from whom would she seek it? She sat in her living room and looked around her and wondered at the smallness of the world she'd made for herself. There were really only two people in it, herself and Charlie. She went outdoors and observed the cedar trees and the hanging baskets and the lush green lawn and the tulips, a splash of red against the house. But she wasn't touched by these things, not the way she'd been touched when she was seeing for Charlie. There'd been a sweetness to the surface of her then that she'd reveled in, and everything that came bubbling out through that surface was also sweet, had a sweet taste to it, and she'd given it to Charlie lovingly, unstintingly. And now it was gone, that layer of sweetness. She was like a face stripped bare of makeup, and beneath it Emma found herself raw and unpredictable. She went back inside, thinking that there was nothing to give shape to her days now. No responsibilities, no obligations, no assignment any more to see the world for Charlie. She had given herself to him as a gift, and it had never occurred to her that this was a gift he might have grown not to want. "My mother was right. There's something unnatural about me," she said to herself, regarding her face in the bathroom mirror. Yet she didn't look particularly unusual. "I'm at the very beginning of my life," she said to herself, but this was only theoretically true. She banged around inside her house for a while, feeling like somebody's caged-up budgie, and then Emma went into the bedroom and took the gun from the drawer, which opened soundlessly, and once more she acknowledged that this was the only truly personal thing he had left behind, and that he'd placed it where she could be sure to find it. So she thought, removing the oily cloth in which it was wrapped, it shouldn't surprise him that she'd adopted it as her own. She put the revolver on the bed and took out the box of cartridges. She selected 6 and loaded the cylinder. She put the cloth and the box back in the drawer and closed it. Emma put the opera glasses in her left-hand jacket pocket and the revolver in her right-hand jacket pocket, picked up her handbag, left the house, got in her car, and headed north, back toward Ruby Lake. Chapter 50. "Look, man," said Gardner, "I'm pleading with you. I'm begging you. We got to get out of here now. Right now, Eddie. Eddie, do you hear me? Do you hear me, man?" "I hear you, Gardner," said Eddie, who was buried in a highway map of the Sunshine Coast. "We're going to get out of here, all right. We're just going to go the long way." Gardner, clutching the top of the steering wheel, let his face fall forward. Eddie thought he might be bawling. "We're going to go up there to Lund," Eddie said stubbornly, "because that's where those boxes are. No question about it. They're up there with her folks," he told Gardner with conviction. "No place else they could be." "I want to go home, Eddie, now." Gardner lifted up his head, and Eddie was relieved to see that he hadn't been bawling after all. Reluctantly, Eddie shook his head. I told you, I'm not driving this heap onto any ferry until I got those notes in my hand. Eddie, Gardner pleaded. The fucking boxes were in one of the fucking bedrooms. They had to be. No, said Eddie, shaking his head. They would have been out in the living room part if they'd been there. Nobody'd keep a dead person's stuff in the bedroom with them. I told you it's at her folks' place, and that's where we're headed. Fuck you, Eddie. Gardner sounded like he was at the end of his rope. Eddie thought he might be near the end of his, too. Lund is a very small place, said Eddie, studying the map. No way there's going to be more than one Franklin family there. We wait till it's dark, we break in, we find the boxes. I get my notes, and that's it. We're homeward bound. You want to steal us a shotgun first? Said Gardner bitterly. Or a rifle, maybe? There ought to be some hunter types living away to hell and gone out here. Then if the dudes wake up, while you're ripping them off, you can just blow them away, too. Eddie sank back in his seat. He raised a hand and wiped his face with it, then gripped his forehead between his thumb and middle finger, rubbing his temples, pressing his forehead. He stared out the window, brooding. They were parked at a roadside rest stop next to a big Jeasley motorhome with Minnesota plates. The people from the motorhome had spread their lunch out on a nearby picnic table. Eddie looked through his window at their food and thought he might have to throw up before long. It won't be ripping them off, he said. I only want to get back what's mine. But Jesus Christ, Eddie, is it worth going around wasting people for? Eddie started folding up the map. The cops don't know nothing about us. There's no way they can know we did it. We? What the fuck's this we? Eddie stared out through the windshield. You're right, he said painfully. Me. They can't know it was me who did it. Yeah, right. They'll find the fucking shotgun, and it's me they'll come after. Eddie turned to him. They won't find the shotgun. Why would they find the shotgun? But if by any chance they do, you just tell them you lent it to me. Gardner snatched a glance at him. You bet I'll do that, too, he said in a mutter. But they won't find it. The only thing they could find that would be bad for us is those notes. Stupid weasel, Gardner grumbled. I told you how dumb that was. Yeah. Eddie slapped the folded map on the dashboard. Come on, let's get out of here. Let's get it over with. She's doing real well, said Constable Gibbons with a smile as Alberg entered Kathy's room. It's very depressing, said Kathy, to actually face the fact that there are definitely people in the world who don't like you. Not many, I'll bet, said Alberg, looking over Sanducci's shoulder at his notebook. No, not many at all. Don't get up, Corporal. I also remembered a couple of weird things that happened, said Kathy, as she told him about the day somebody had taken their mail and then put it back. And we found out later there was a letter missing from the theater company that hired us. What did it say? That they hoped we wouldn't change our minds about coming to Seashelt. Alberg nodded. What was the other thing? There's a woman who lives across the street from us. She broke off suddenly. This doesn't feel real. None of this feels real. Go on, Kathy, said Nora Gibbons. What about her? What's her name? Her name, it's Garber, Mrs. Garber. And what do you want to tell us about her? Kathy was staring into Constable Gibbons' face. I'm the only one left. I know, Kathy, I know. Now, tell us about Mrs. Garber. She came over the night before we left to tell us... What? Said Alberg gently. She'd seen somebody lurking, she said. Lurking around her house, but she said he seemed to be interested in our house. She reached for Nora Gibbons' hand. I am really scared. I don't know what's going on. I know, but hang in there, Kathy. We need you. Okay? I'll try, okay. Tell me about this list of names, said Alberg. This first part, said Sanducci, pointing. These people date
from before the 4 girls started sharing a house.
Women, said Kathy.
Sanducci looked startled then. Oh, sorry, women, the 4 women.
Uh-huh, said Alberg.
Good. Okay, Kathy, tell me about them, and let's start with the most recent and work our way back.
The first one was, well, it was still going on when we came over here, said Kathy. She reached for a glass of water. It was a guy Caroline was going out with. He gave her a bad time for a while. She took a long drink.
What kind of a bad time? Said Constable Gibbons.
She told him she didn't want to see him anymore, but he couldn't take no for an answer, you know, at least at first. So he sent her these, like, voluminous letters, and later he'd send her taped ones. She played them for us. There was nothing really bad in them. They were just vaguely threatening.
Did she keep them? Said Alberg. Kathy shook her head. She burned the letters and sent the tapes back to him. And he's the first name here?
Yeah.
The next guy, this is reaching pretty far, I have to tell you. It's somebody Melanie had some trouble with. I don't know exactly what. Drugstore guy, said Alberg, reading from Sanducci's list.
Yeah, said Kathy. I don't know his name. She had some kind of a run-in with him. She hesitated. Melanie could be a little haughty, you know, so sometimes she offended people. But this time, whatever it was, she was kind of shaken up.
Okay, and the third one, Sam Peterson.
Yeah, said Kathy glumly. He's mine. You know, I really don't like this. I feel like I'm slandering people.
I know, said Alberg, smiling at her.
Sam Peterson. It was last fall. He wanted me to be in a student film he was directing, and I said no. But I'd said yes first, so he got pretty mad. Really mad. Raged around, throwing things and stuff.
Have you heard from him since?
He called me up when he'd finished his film and told me the actress who'd done it was a lot better than I'd ever be.
She shrugged.
That's all.
Okay, Sam. Who's next? Said Alberg, glancing at his watch. Back at the detachment, he got a call from Vancouver about the hit and run. Did you do a background check on the victim? He asked. We did the whole 9 yards. Sure we did a background check. What do you know? Why are you interested, Staff Sergeant? She had 3 roommates. Yeah. They came up here for the summer. Yeah. 2 of them got blown away last night. There was silence from Vancouver. The 3rd one would have got it too, said Alberg. Except she dived out her bedroom window and got away. He heard the shuffling of papers. Then, vehicles, 81 Camaro, bronze over original red. We're working on an area vehicle check through motor vehicles. Thanks, said Alberg.
Chapter 51. Eddie would have laughed about it, except for the situation they were in. He ought to have known better than to go anywhere in a car belonging to Gardner without checking the thing out himself. I never heard of anybody, he said heavily, gazing at the useless Oldsmobile, who didn't carry an extra fan belt with him. Well, you've heard of him now, said Gardner defensively. He kicked the right front tire, which to Eddie didn't make much sense. So what the fuck do we do now? It's your car, Gardner. And it's your fucking neck, Ed, Gardner snapped. Eddie lumbered over to the edge of the gravel shoulder and leaned against a big tree. He was very tired. He thought about his apartment, his bedroom. It had a little window high up in the wall, and there was a flower bed on the other side of it. In the summertime, the leaves of the dahlias were all that he could see. Eddie never bothered to close the curtains in the summertime because the dahlias kept out the sun and nobody could see through them into his bedroom. They were up now, the dahlias. Summer had already started, really, even though the weather wasn't good yet. There was lots of stuff growing and blooming. Inside Eddie's bedroom was his bed, which was a 3/4 size bed, and he had a wooden table next to it with a lamp on top and an ashtray, just in case he felt like having a smoke in the middle of the night.
There was a small chest of drawers, too, but he had to keep it inside the closet because there wasn't room for it anywhere else. Through the open door of his bedroom, when he lay in his bed waiting to go to sleep, he could see pretty clearly into the living room because of the light from the street lamp that fell in through the window out there. He wished he were home right now, making himself some dinner or watching TV or going through his envelopes or talking to Sylvia on the phone. His longing to be home was like a big ache, and this ache, in addition to hurting him, made him terribly sad. Gardner was slouched against the fender of the Oldsmobile, lighting a cigarette. Eddie watched him wave the match in the air until it went out and then drop it on the ground. It was still too wet to worry about forest fires. They were on a deserted stretch of the highway. There was some traffic now and then, but no other sign of life at all. All Eddie could see north and south was the highway, narrow and curving, with forest crowding close on both sides. He figured they were about half an hour from Earl's Cove, which the map said was the name of the place, where they'd take a ferry over to the other side of Jervis Inlet, where Powell River was, and then Lund. "So what do you want to do?" said Gardner. "Hitchhike?" He cackled, and Eddie thought that was probably a good sign. He was getting back to normal. "Or maybe there's buses come along here," said Gardner, and he cackled again. "No," said Eddie, who must have been thinking about it, because here he was with an idea. "We're going to have to flag somebody down. Get him to take us somewhere, to a town somewhere, where we can find a car to take." "Take? Take! Borrow!" "Borrow?" Gardner was cackling again. "For a while," said Eddie, "just until we get home." "Why don't we just borrow the one the guy's in that we flagged down?" "Because he'll be looking right at us," said Eddie patiently. "And as soon as we take off, he'll call the cops." He glanced left and right at the unfriendly woods. It might take him a while to find a phone, but sooner or later we'd be dead meat. They poised themselves expectantly on the highway side of Gardner's Olds and began to wait. Gardner finished his cigarette and lit up another one. A car appeared, a speck in the distance, and got big enough to reveal itself as a station wagon, and Eddie and Gardner waved vigorously, but the wagon shot by without anybody in it even giving them a glance. This happened several times. Finally, Eddie took a good look at Gardner. "You look like shit," he said, disapprovingly. Gardner's denim overalls were oil-splotched and food-stained. His work boots were scuffed and dusty. The flannel shirt was frayed at the collar. Most of his hair was standing straight up, forced upward when he pulled off the nylon mask, frozen there by dirt and vestiges of mousse. Also, he needed a shave, as usual. So did Eddie, of course, but in every other way his appearance was an improvement over Gardner's. "Stand over there," he ordered Gardner, "behind the car." Gardner protested and lit another smoke. "Can I have one of those?" said Eddie irritably. He shouldn't have had to ask. Gardner should have noticed that he'd run out hours ago. Chapter 52. Emma, driving, let memory flood unchecked and examined with scrupulous deliberation the recollection that emerged. It was Charlie laughing. She couldn't remember the occasion, but it was a real memory, all right, and there was such love in his eyes, such openness in his face, that she felt an eager surge of hope. Reminiscence is not a good idea, she thought, driving, her hands tight on the wheel. She was being careful to keep strictly to the speed limit. She couldn't allow herself to get pulled over with a loaded gun in her pocket. She'd park at the top of the hill and wait until it got dark. Wait until there were no lights burning in the cafe or in any of the motel units, and then she'd drive down the hill and park across the highway. And then she'd walk over there, around the cafe and back where the motel was, and she'd find Charlie. She was going to scare the hell out of Charlie O'Bray, She had it all planned. She had to be angry, though, to do it. Where had all her anger gone? Chased away by that image of Charlie laughing. She conjured up another. "I'll bleed all over her sofa," Emma had told him. He believed her, too. He'd looked awful as it sunk in, so bug-eyed and sweaty that for a split second she almost changed her mind and let him have his damn divorce. But she'd kept her mouth shut and just stood there, feeling very strong, extremely strong, victorious, knowing this was a phase, and there would be another one and another, straining in her mind to see beyond the present and all the intermediate phases to the last one, where there would be peace between them again, and they would stretch out their hands to one another, knowing they would get there, but wondering how long it would take and how much pain there would be. Charlie's eyes bugged out more and more. Emma was fascinated. Is it possible, she wondered, is it physiologically possible that they might pop out altogether? And if that happens, what on earth can I do about it? She'd catch them in her hands, she decided, and slap them back into their sockets and hope for the best. Then Charlie whirled around, looking for something. Emma couldn't imagine what. The vase? The big vase? He was striding to the corner table where it sat holding branches of bright yellow forsythia, and he picked it up and hurled it. Emma watched, astonished, as it soared across the room and crashed into the mirror above the fireplace. And Charlie proceeded to demolish the living room. Emma found her voice and shouted at him to stop. She ducked as books and heavy ashtrays flew through the air. She flung up her arms to shield her face from flying glass and china and crystal. It seemed to last forever, but finally it stopped. She heard a tinkling sound, window glass falling from its frame. She heard Charlie's harsh breath coming fast and faster. She stood with her head bowed, waiting, heard Charlie's feet crunch across the debris and down the hall, heard the front door open and slam shut. Emma went into the kitchen after a while and made a pot of tea. She sat at the table drinking it and wondering what was going to happen next. Her life had been detonated. Its pieces had fallen willy-nilly around her head. A long time later, Charlie came back. He'd brought an emergency glass person with him. The glass man was chattering cheerfully when he came through the front door with Charlie. "Whoops," he said when he saw the inside of the house. And that was the last word he spoke the whole time he was there. Charlie directed the glass man to the broken windows. Then he got some cardboard cartons from the garage and some garbage bags from under the kitchen sink and started working on the mess. Good, thought Emma, and she went to bed. She thought that was the worst of it, but it wasn't. Now she realized that waking up and seeing the gun wasn't the worst of it either, nor was involuntarily filling the bed with her own urine. The worst of it came after that. Now, only now, she knew this. Charlie broke down and began sobbing, and she comforted him. Sitting in her pee, she comforted him. She could smell it, her pee, as she held Charlie's face tightly to her breasts and stroked the nape of his neck and said, "Shh," over and over. He calmed, gradually. She handed him some tissues. He took them and wiped his face. He looked like, well, Emma had heard the phrase, "like a beaten dog," but never having seen a beaten dog, she hadn't known exactly what it meant until this moment. Tears came into her eyes as she looked at him, her husband, the beaten dog. Charlie looked back at her, and something changed in his face. "I'm sorry," he said. At the time, she'd thought the change in his expression was the re-emerging of his love for her, the forging of a new resolve to live with her kindly and purposefully. "I'm sorry," said Charlie. Now she knew that he had been apologizing not for what he'd done, but for what he was going to do. In that moment, Charlie had decided that he would leave, and how he would leave. Furtively, stealthily, craftily, like the sneaking son of a bitch he must have been all along. And all that stuff he was to spew about starting over had been nothing but a lie. The whole last perfect year. One big lie. And how had this happened? How had she gotten from calmly deciding upon wifehood as a career to attempted suicide, to threats of public blood spilling? Is this what devotion is, Emma wondered? What love is? What madness is? Had she let Charlie drive her into madness? "Son of a bitch!" Emma shouted, pounding on the steering wheel, glancing skyward through the windshield, and she looked back at the road just as a large man appeared from nowhere to leap directly into the path of her car. Emma wrenched the wheel to the right and trod hard on the brake pedal. The man was at her window before she came to a complete stop. "Sorry," he said. "Sorry to scare you like that." Emma rolled down the window. "What's the matter with you?" she said, shaking, her voice shaking too. "Don't you know I could have killed you?" He gestured to a car about 50 feet away, sitting at the side of the road. "My car broke down." "I'll get you some help," said Emma, starting to roll up the window. "No, hey, we need a ride." "We?" "Yeah, me and my friend there." She saw another man appear from behind the parked car. He was wearing overalls. "It's out of the question," she said, watching the man with the overalls loping toward them. "Hey, no, I'm sorry, but we gotta get to town, see?" "I told you," said Emma. "I'll call somebody for you. I'll get you some help." "Open the fucking door," said the man in the overalls. They were both crowding against the car now. Emma had managed to roll the window up halfway, but the big man had his arm inside, and she could smell dirt and sweat and strangeness. "I will get you help," she shouted. "Leave me alone. Get your arm out of my car." "Fuck this, I'm getting a rock," said the man in the overalls, and he half turned away. "No," shouted Emma, and she pulled the revolver out of her pocket. "No." The man wearing overalls glanced back. When he saw the gun, he turned a greeny-white color. His eyeballs rolled up, and he crashed to the ground. Eddie, watching her, considered taking his arm out of the window. He felt pretty stupid with it stuck in there anyway. But then a whole lot of stuff went through his head very fast. And the thing that stuck there, the thing that mattered, was that what he was seeing in the face of this person was his doom. He gazed at Emma with extraordinary tenderness and thrust his arm farther into the car. His hand, she thought, seeking the lock on the door. "No," said Emma, "please." And she shut her eyes, averted her face, and fired. Chapter 53. The window shattered, spraying Emma with hard-edged pieces of glass. The roar made by the firing of the revolver went on and on. Emma sat in the driver's seat, shaking and weeping, her eyes still tightly closed. The revolver had flown out of her hand. She wiped that hand again and again on her jacket, crying out. She didn't know what she was saying. She couldn't hear herself. She couldn't hear anything but the roar. It was as if a bomb had gone off in the car. "Maybe I'm hurt," she thought. Her eyes flew open, and she looked quickly down at herself, but saw no sign of injury. But, oh God, what about the big man with the red hair? Her heart was pounding so hard. Maybe that's what's making the roaring noise, she thought. Maybe it's my heart. She scrabbled for the seatbelt release, her hands shaking so much she was afraid for a moment she wouldn't be able to do it, that she'd have to sit there for eternity, in hell or in purgatory, forever unable to flee the scene of her crime. But finally the seatbelt popped free. Emma scrambled across the passenger seat, unlocked the door, and opened it, and fell out onto the ground. She lay on the grass that met the shoulder of the road, facing the car. On the other side, she could see two inert bodies. It was only right, she thought, that she lie there with them, separated from them only by the width of the car, until somebody came along who knew what to do in situations like this, somebody who could take charge of the bodies, all three of them, and the gun too. She felt her breath on her hand and the wetness of tears that continued to fall. She stared hard at the two bodies on the other side of the car, willing life into them. And it worked, too. One of them started moving. He got himself up on his hands and knees, leaning over the other one. And then, through the roaring, Emma heard a shriek and saw him try to stand up and fall and try again. And this time he made it, and she saw him stagger away, moving unsteadily as if he were drunk. But the other man kept on lying there, still as a stone. Finally, Emma pushed herself to her feet. She made herself go around the car and look down at the red-haired man. Then she started walking shakily along the edge of the highway. It took her 20 minutes to get to the Ruby Lake Cafe. She pushed the door open and stood there with her back to the sun, and for a minute she couldn't see anything. She blinked several times, and shapes began to emerge. A long counter, several small tables, each with 4 chairs, linoleum on the floor, a blackboard menu behind the counter. And Charlie, standing very still and looking at her. He was the only person there. Emma was glad of that. She saw that his mouth was open, and he was saying something. "I can't hear you," she said. Her voice sounded small and distant. "I can't hear you," she said loudly. "There's a big roaring. I can't hear anything." She started to move toward him. He slipped around the corner of the counter so that he was behind it. "Oh, damn! I didn't bring the gun," Emma thought. She sat on one of the counter stools. Why had she wanted to bring the gun anyway? She looked long and hard at Charlie and placed both hands on the countertop in front of her. She saw for the first time that there was blood on them. She took a napkin from the metal container in front of her and started brushing at her hands. Charlie took one too and dampened it at the sink behind him. He reached out and put his left hand against the nape of Emma's neck. She hoped very much that he wasn't planning to kiss her. "I don't want you to kiss me, Charlie. I never liked being kissed by you, I'm afraid." She couldn't tell what he was thinking. With his right hand he started wiping her face very gently, and she saw blood stain the napkin and saw tiny chunks of glass falling as he wiped. "I wouldn't have done it, Charlie, I think," she said. "I don't think I would have done that to Helena." She spoke loudly, pushing each word separately through the world of noise in which she was trapped. She didn't say anything more. She lived in the roar of noise and felt flicks of pain ripple across her face and looked into Charlie's eyes and didn't know him. When he was finished, he leaned very close and said, "What happened?" "I shot somebody." She started to shake again. "Dead." She pulled her jacket closely around her, causing her hands to sting. "It was an accident. You better call the police." After he made the call, Charlie poured her some coffee and poured some for himself, too. He came around the counter to sit next to her. He put his left hand over her right hand, and Emma looked curiously at this, her small pale hand covered almost completely by Charlie's larger brown one. She gazed into his face. She could ask him about her picture now. She was pretty sure he'd tell her just about anything she wanted to know. She could ask him why he'd put the gun in the night-table drawer. "I wonder if this roaring in my head will ever go away," she said. She withdrew her hand from under Charlie's and took off her wedding ring and her jade ring and her silver bracelet. She put them down in front of her. After a while, she slid them along the countertop to Charlie. "I don't want these any more." Charlie started to protest. Then he turned quickly to look out the window, and Emma did too, and saw the police car. They stood up. "Charlie," she said, and he turned back to her, "please come to the house at your earliest convenience, and pack up all your things." Chapter 54. "I'll do it for you," said Sanducci. "What?" said Kathy, amazed. They were sitting in the hospital waiting room. Kathy was wearing clothes brought to her by Nora Gibbons, shorts and a T-shirt and a pair of thongs. "Yeah," said Sanducci, who was keeping her company until her parents arrived. "I'll do it. I mean, somebody has to. It might as well be me." "I thought my Mom and Dad and I would—" "Come on, Miss Schofield. You don't want to go back in that house." "No, I don't want to." "So let me do it. I'm off duty in a couple of hours. I'll take care of it then." He watched her push her hair away from the side of her face. He was very relieved that she was no longer in danger. "Corporal Sanducci." "Eduardo," said Sanducci, flushing, but this caused her to smile at him, so he didn't mind it. He thought she was the most beautiful woman he'd ever met. "You call me Kathy, then, okay?" Kathy, right. Maybe not beautiful, he couldn't tell, but he definitely never met anybody he liked looking at so much. Her smile faded away. "When you go there, will it be cleaned up?" "Not yet." "Who does that?" "The owner of the house, or else he'll hire somebody." They were sitting on a vinyl sofa near the door, next to a tall plant. Kathy reached out and brushed a layer of dust from one of its large, thick leaves. "I never thought about that before," she said. "I mean, when I read in the paper about things like this happening, I never thought about who'd be cleaning it up." She glanced at Sanducci. "I guess I kind of assumed it would be the police." Sanducci shook his head. "No," said Kathy. "I mean, it's bad enough you have to spend time there looking for evidence and stuff. You don't want to have to clean it up as well." She tucked her hands together in her lap. "I feel like doing it, you know. I don't mean I want to exactly, but I just feel like I ought to do it." "Because you got away and they didn't?" He wanted to go to bed with her for sure, of course he did, but he thought that if he couldn't do that, he'd be happy to just sit here and look at her and listen to her for the rest of his life. "Yeah, maybe," she said, "but also, it would be doing something for them, you know?" "No," said Sanducci, "you're wrong about that. They wouldn't want you to do that for them. They definitely would not want that." Through the glass doors he saw a middle-aged couple hurrying from the parking lot toward the hospital. "I'll get Nora to help me," he said, turning his service cap in his hands. "We'll get your stuff and your roommates too. And, I could probably go over there in a day or so. Take it to you over there in Richmond, at your folks' place, if you want." "That would be great," said Kathy, smiling at him. Her parents burst through the door, and Sanducci stood and watched while Kathy ran toward them and into their arms. "Hold up there like a rat in a nest. I never did like that man," said Bernie, her arms crossed over her flat chest. "I don't think I'm ever going to hear it properly again," said Emma, banging her left temple with the heel of her hand. She was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. "Sid Sokolovsky told me that might happen." "You just be happy you're alive. Never mind you can't hear things right. You could have been killed dead like those poor girls." "Will you go to court with me, Bernie, for moral support?" "You just bet your life I will." Self-defense, that was Emma's plea. Her lawyer was pretty confident, but there were weapons charges, too. "At least I didn't have to stay in jail," she said with a shudder. "I would have stopped doing for Mr. Alberg," said Bernie fiercely, "if he'd clapped you in jail." She'd been released on recognizance because she was known in the community and not considered to be a danger to herself or others. Emma had found the whole process humiliating, but fascinating. She was going to sell the house and move somewhere, just as soon as this business was over, and she was free to go where she liked. She looked out the window into the backyard. She thought about the red-haired man. It ought to make her feel better about shooting him, knowing he'd murdered 2 people. But it didn't. She couldn't get it out of her mind, the inexplicable gentleness on his face just before she killed him. "We don't know which one of them actually did the shooting," said Alberg. "The one that's alive blames the one that's dead, of course." "Isn't there some way you can tell for sure?" said Cassandra. "He showed us where they dropped the weapon, so we've got prints, but both of them handled the shotgun, so that's no help. The dead guy's the one with the motive, and it's his car that ran down Melanie Franklin, so I'm inclined to think it was him, all right." They were on the ferry that crosses Jervis Inlet, on their way to Lund. It was breezy and cold out on the deck, so they'd moved inside and were sitting in the cafeteria. Alberg looked across the table at Cassandra. "Thanks for coming with me." "Thanks for asking me." There was an awkward silence. They were supposed to be talking, trying to work out which one of them was going to move, but now neither of them wanted to be the one to bring it up. 20 minutes later they were driving off the ferry at Saltery Bay, heading up the highway toward Powell River. They passed through Westview and the Powell River townsite, where the pulp mill belched smoke into the air, and then they were on the road to Lund. Cassandra, studying the map, followed the highway, a confident red line moving up the coast from Langdale to Gibson's to Seashelt to Earl's Cove, and starting again across the inlet at Saltery Bay, and going northwest to Powell River, and through the hamlet of Sleeman, and beyond to this place called Lund, where it simply stopped. There was no way to continue up the coastline, except by boat. What if it turned out that she didn't like living with Karl Alberg on a regular basis, sharing housekeeping tasks, and the food bills, and the television set, and the bathroom? What if she didn't like sharing a bed with him on a regular basis? They drove through forests and past acreages, past signs directing them westward through the trees to oceanfront campsites. And then the road took a curve to the left, up a lilting little rise, and they drove around the curve and saw the village of Lund, clustered around a small but perfect harbor. The highway ran straight toward that harbor and drowned itself in the waters of the Pacific Ocean. Alberg parked across from the hotel, and they got out of the car. Still, thought Cassandra, gazing out at the sea, she wasn't the only person getting into cohabitation in midlife. She'd have to learn to be flexible. That was the important thing. They went into the hotel cafe, where they found a waitress, 3 townspeople, and 2 tourists